To understand the silence of the synthetic, we must first listen to the whispers of the earth. We must cast our minds back, drifting through the currents of time, past the steel and glass of the modern metropolis, past the roaring engines of the Industrial Revolution, and past the stone fortresses of the medieval world. We must return to a time when the horizon was vast and unbroken, when the sky was a terrified mystery, and when the only pharmacy known to mankind was the soil beneath his feet. Before the cold precision of modern laboratories, before the white coats and the sterile lights, the promise of relief was found in the roots, the leaves and the flowers that swayed in the primordial winds. Pain is the oldest companion of the human experience. It is a ghost that has haunted our biology since the very first breath of our species.
In the mornings they went to the mountains looking for ore and gold. During the day the girl was alone. The good dwarfs warned her, saying, "Oh, be careful of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Do not let anyone in." Now the queen, believing that she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver, could only think that she was again the first and the most beautiful woman of all.
Imagine standing in the year 3400 BC, amidst the mud-brick ziggurats and the irrigation canals of the Sumerians. Before you lies a field of flowers, their petals delicate and paper-thin, ranging in color from a pale, ghostly white to a deep, bruising purple. They nod rhythmically in the breeze, a sea of somnolent heads. This is Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy. The Sumerians, those great architects of writing and law, possessed a wisdom that was inextricably linked to the cycles of nature. They observed the world with keen, dark eyes, noting the properties of every living thing. They saw how this particular flower, unlike the others, held a secret within its green, bulbous capsule. They called it Hul Gil, the joy plant. It is a name that echoes with a profound and tragic irony across the millennia. To the ancient laborer toiling under the relentless sun, or to the warrior nursing a shattered limb, the poppy was indeed a vessel of joy, or at least the absence of sorrow. It was a divine intervention, a mercy granted by the earth itself. Let us linger for a moment on the harvest of this ancient mercy. It was a ritual of patience and timing, unchanged for thousands of years. As the petals fell away, leaving the round, green pod exposing its crown to the sky, the harvesters would move through the fields in the twilight. The heat of the day would be fading, replaced by the cooling breath of the desert evening. With a sharp blade, perhaps made of obsidian or later of bronze, they would gently score the skin of the poppy pod. It was a delicate surgery. Cut too deep, and the precious fluid would flow inward and be lost. Cut too shallow, and nothing would emerge. From these weeping wounds, a milky white latex would seep out. In the cool air of the night, this milk would oxidize, darkening into a sticky brown gum. This was raw opium. It was the condensed sweat of the flower, a chemical cocktail of incredible complexity, synthesized by the sun and the soil. The ancients did not know of alkaloids or molecular bonds. They knew only of the tears of the poppy. They scraped this resin from the pods, collecting it in clay jars, a dark treasure more valuable than gold to a man in agony. When eaten or dissolved in wine, it produced a sensation that felt like being wrapped in the heavy, warm velvet of the night sky. It slowed the breath, it heavy-lidded the eyes, and most importantly, it placed a soft, insurmountable wall between the mind and the pain of the body. This knowledge, this mastery of the flower, did not stay within the borders of Sumer. It flowed like water, carried by traders and travelers along the ancient arteries of commerce. It traveled down the Nile, into the golden kingdom of Egypt. Here, the poppy found a new home in the rich, black silt of the riverbanks. The Egyptians, with their obsession for the afterlife and the preservation of the body, revered the poppy. In the great medical papyri, those fragile scrolls that document the ailments of the pharaohs and the commoners alike, the poppy is prescribed for a multitude of sorrows. It was said to stop the crying of children, to ease the passing of the dying, to allow the weary to sleep. The city of Thebes became famous for its poppy fields, producing a preparation known as thebacum, a name that would echo into the history of medicine for centuries. We can imagine the Egyptian physicians, the priests of Sekhmet, mixing the dark resin with fly excrement, honey, and beer, chanting incantations as they administered the drug. They believed that the poppy was a gift from the goddess Isis to the sun god Ra, given to cure his headaches. In this mythology, we see the dual nature of the substance beginning to take shape. It was a tool of the gods, a substance that bridged the gap between the mortal and the divine. To consume it was to taste a fragment of eternity, to dissolve the boundaries of the self in a warm, golden haze. As the centuries turned like the pages of a slow-moving book, the poppy spread its influence across the Mediterranean, taking root in the rocky soil of Greece. Here, the relationship between man and the flower became more philosophical, more poetic. The Greeks, who gave names to every wind and every emotion, gave a face to the power of the poppy. They spoke of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and his son Morpheus, the god of dreams. In the artistry of the time, Hypnos is often depicted holding a bunch of poppies, or pouring a sleep-inducing liquid from a horn. Morpheus, the shaper of dreams, would emerge from the dark cave of his father, his wings silent as an owl's, to touch the foreheads of mortals with the juice of the poppy. It was in Greece that the poppy entered the realm of epic poetry. In the Odyssey, Homer sings of Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships, mixing a drug called nepenthe into the wine of her guests. Into the bowl in which their wine was mixed, she slipped a drug that had the power of robbing grief and anger of their sting, and banishing all painful memories. Scholars and historians have long debated the identity of nepenthe, but the consensus whispers that it was opium. It was the drug of forgetfulness, the eraser of trauma. In a world defined by the brutality of Bronze Age warfare, by the sack of cities and the slaughter of kin, the ability to forget, to simply cease to care, was a power beyond measure. But with the power of the flower came the first warnings, the first shadows casting themselves across the history of medicine. The Greeks understood that the poppy was a pharmakona word that means both remedy and poison. The difference lay only in the dosage. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, used it sparingly, recognizing its potency. He knew that the sleep it induced could be deep and restorative, but he also knew that if the dose was too high, the sleep would become eternal. The poppy demanded respect. It was not a benign herb like mint or sage. It was a dominator of the will. The Roman Empire, with its vast appetite for conquest and luxury, consumed opium with voracious intensity. It was the age of the theriac, a complex, fermented concoction containing dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh and spices, but always anchored by the heavy weight of opium. Emperors like Marcus Aurelius were known to take theriac daily, a habit that historians suggest was a functional addiction. It allowed him to bear the weight of the empire, the endless wars on the Danube, the treachery of the court. The poppy had become a tool of statecraft, a way for the rulers of the world to maintain their composure amidst the collapsing chaos of antiquity. When the lights of Rome flickered and died, plunging Europe into the long, brooding twilight of the Dark Ages, the knowledge of the poppy did not vanish. It migrated east, preserved in the great libraries and hospitals of the Islamic Golden Age. While Europe bled and prayed, Arab physicians like Avicenna were refining the use of opium. They wrote detailed treatises on its effects, noting its ability to stop diarrhea, a major killer in the ancient world, and its unrivaled power to suppress a cough. They created the sponge of sleep, a precursor to anesthesia, where a sponge soaked in dissolved opium and other herbs was placed over the patient's nose. It was a time of caravans and caliphs, of spices and silk. The poppy traveled the Silk Road, finding its way into the courts of China and the temples of India. It became a global commodity, a currency of relief that transcended language and culture. Wherever there was pain, there was a market for the tears of the poppy. It was smoked in long, intricate pipes. It was eaten in small, bitter balls. It was dissolved in alcohol. And then, the world began to wake from its medieval slumber. The Renaissance brought a renewed curiosity about the natural world, a desire to unlock the secrets hidden within matter. The Swiss alchemist Paracelsus, a man of wild hair and even wilder ideas, returned from his travels in the East with a secret remedy he called laudanum, from the Latin laudare, to praise. He carried it in the pommel of his sword, claiming it was the stone of immortality. In truth, it was a simple tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. But this simple innovation changed everything. Alcohol acted as a solvent, extracting the alkaloids more efficiently than water, making the medicine stable, portable, and potent. Laudanum became the aspirin of the pre-industrial age. It was found in every apothecary's cabinet, a reddish-brown liquid that smelled of saffron and wine, capable of soothing a colicky infant or silencing the hacking cough of a consumptive poet. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the poppy had fully infiltrated the cultural bloodstream of the West. It was the era of the Romantic poets, of Coleridge dreaming of Xanadu under the influence of the milk of paradise, of Thomas de Quincey writing his Confessions of an English Opium Eater. The drug was romanticized, viewed as a gateway to the sublime, a tool for unlocking the hidden chambers of the imagination. But beneath the artistic veneer, the dark side of the poppy was becoming impossible to ignore. Addiction was the shadow that followed the relief. The joy plant was also the chain maker. Men and women found themselves enslaved to the bottle of laudanum, their bodies demanding the drug with a ferocity that superseded hunger or love. Yet, science was marching forward, driven by the insatiable curiosity of the Enlightenment. The natural world was no longer enough. Men wanted to know why things worked. They wanted to dismantle the watch to see the gears. In 1804, in a small, cluttered laboratory in Paderborn, Germany, a young pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Serturner changed the course of history. He did something that had never been done before. He isolated the active ingredient of a medicinal plant. Serturner took raw opium and subjected it to a series of chemical baths, dissolving, precipitating, and filtering, until he was left with a residue of white, bitter crystals. He tested these crystals on stray dogs, and then, with the reckless bravery of early science, on himself and 3 friends. The result was a sleep so deep it bordered on coma. He had distilled the essence of the poppy, stripping away the plant matter, the gums, and the oils, leaving only the pure, concentrated soul of the drug. He named it morphium, after Morpheus, the god of dreams. We know it today as morphine. This was a watershed moment. For the first time, humanity held a consistent, measurable dose of pain relief. No longer did a doctor have to guess at the potency of a batch of raw opium, which could vary wildly depending on the rain and the soil. Now, they had a white powder, mathematically precise. The invention of the hypodermic needle in the mid-19th century gave this new powder a terrifying immediacy. Morphine could be injected directly into the blood, bypassing the stomach, delivering instant, overwhelming relief. It became the soldier's joy, the angel of the battlefield. During the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, morphine saved tens of thousands from dying of shock. It silenced the screams of the amputation tents, but it also created an army of addicts. The soldier's disease, they called it. Men returning home, their bodies healed, but their souls tethered to the needle. The velvet curtain of morphine was heavy indeed, and once it fell, it was difficult to lift. But nature, for all its gifts, is inconsistent. The poppy, despite being the source of this miracle, remained a creature of the earth. It was bound by the laws of biology and geography. It relied on the rain, on the pH of the soil, on the specific angle of the sun. A drought in Turkey or a blight in India could send the world's supply of pain relief into chaos. Wars could sever the trade routes, leaving hospitals without their most crucial supply. Furthermore, the poppy was politically volatile. The opium wars between Britain and China had shown that this flower could topple empires and destroy societies. As the industrial age began to turn, grinding its great gears towards the atomic age, the limitations of the botanical became a source of frustration for the scientific mind. The early 20th century was a time of immense hubris and ambition. Humanity had conquered the air with the airplane. It had conquered the night with electricity. It had conquered distance with the radio. Why should it still be beholden to a fragile flower for its medicine? The alchemists of the 20th century, now called chemists, sought to surpass the flower. They looked at the morphine molecule not as a gift from God, but as a blueprint, a starting point. They saw its structure, the benzene ring, the nitrogen bridge, the complex architecture of atoms that allowed it to fit into the receptors of the human brain like a key in a lock. But they also saw its flaws. Morphine was slow to act. It caused nausea. It caused itching, releasing histamines that made the skin crawl. It lingered in the body too long. The medical community, particularly the emerging field of anesthesiology, yearned for a power that did not grow from the ground. Surgery was becoming more complex. Doctors were cracking open the chest to operate on the heart. They were delving into the delicate gray matter of the brain. They needed anesthetics that were potent, fast-acting, and clean. They needed a drug that could turn the patient off like a switch and turn them back on again just as easily. They desired a purity that biology, with all its messiness and variation, could not provide. They wanted a mathematical perfection of analgesia. The world was moving faster. The slow, rhythmic pace of the agricultural past was giving way to the frenetic speed of the modern era. The reliance on a crop that took months to grow and had to be harvested by hand seemed archaic. The chemists looked to the byproducts of the coal and oil industries, seeing in the black sludge the potential to create crystals of white purity. They began to dream of a drug that was forged entirely in the mind of man, assembled atom by atom in the retort and the beaker. The era of the botanical was fading. The ancient fields of Mesopotamia, the temple gardens of Egypt, the trade routes of the Silk Road, these were becoming ghosts of the past. The poppy would remain, of course, continuing to bloom and bleed its milk in the remote corners of the world, but the cutting edge of science was turning away from the field and towards the laboratory. The era of the synthetic was about to dawn. It would be a new age, silent and potent. It would bring with it miracles of healing that the ancients could scarcely imagine, allowing for the suspension of life itself on the operating table. But it would also bring a coldness, a detachment from the natural order. The new molecules would not be born of the sun and the rain. They would be born of calculation and chemical reaction. They would be stronger, faster, and more efficient than anything nature had ever devised. And in that strength, in that terrible efficiency, lay a new and unforeseen danger. As the sun sets on the fields of Papaver somniferum, casting long shadows over the history of human pain, we prepare to enter the sterile, bright, and silent world of the synthetic. A world where a single man, with a pencil and a piece of paper, could design a substance that would alter the destiny of millions. A world where the distance between a cure and a curse is measured not in cups or bowls, but in microscopic grains of white dust. The wind no longer sweeps across the plains. The air is still. The only sound is the hum of the ventilation system and the scratching of a pen in a notebook. The alchemist is ready to begin his work. The mist clings to the flatlands of Flanders. It is a landscape of muted greens and brick reds, a place where the horizon seems infinitely distant and the sky presses down with a heavy, leaden weight. We find ourselves in the middle of the 20th century, in the quiet, orderly town of Beerse, Belgium. The year is drifting through the late 1950s. The scars of the Second World War are healing, slowly fading into the soil that has drunk the blood of empires for generations. But here, in this corner of the world, the sound of artillery has been replaced by a profound and industrious silence. It is the silence of reconstruction, of a world trying to piece itself back together, not with stone and mortar alone, but with ideas, with science, and with a desperate, unspoken need to alleviate the suffering of the human condition. In this damp, quiet countryside, where the canal water moves like dark glass and the brick factories hum with a rhythmic, earthly purpose, a new kind of cathedral was being built. It was not a cathedral of spires and stained glass, reaching towards the heavens to beg for mercy. It was a cathedral of glass beakers, of Bunsen burners, and of scribbled formulas. It was a sanctuary of the intellect. And at the center of this sanctuary stood a man who would change the course of medical history, a man who saw the invisible architecture of the universe and dared to rearrange its furniture. This was Dr. Paul Janssen. To understand the molecule, we must first understand the mind that conceived it. Paul Janssen was not merely a chemist, he was a visionary who straddled the line between the rigid laws of physics and the intuitive art of creation. He was a man possessed by a singular, driving philosophy, that there is a mathematical solution to biological pain. He viewed the human body not as a mystical vessel, but as a complex machine, a series of locks waiting for the correct keys. And if nature had not forged the perfect key in the roots of a plant or the venom of a snake, then it was the duty of man to forge it himself. He was a tall, imposing figure, often lost in thought, his mind moving like a grandmaster on a chessboard that spanned the molecular world. He had grown up in the shadow of medicine. His father was a doctor who had instilled in him a reverence for the patient and a frustration with the limited tools available to the healer. In the 1950s, the doctor's bag was still largely filled with the ghosts of the 19th century. Morphine was the king, heavy and blunt. Ether was the crude hammer of anesthesia. The world was modernizing. Jet engines were screaming across the skies. Televisions were flickering in living rooms. But in the operating theater, the tools of pain management were still dangerously archaic. Janssen established his laboratory in the brick buildings of his parents' business, a modest beginning that belied the monumental ambition within. It was here, in the hushed stillness of Beerse, that the alchemist began his work. We call him an alchemist not because he dabbled in magic, but because he sought the philosopher's stone of pharmacology, a substance of pure potency, stripped of impurities, stripped of side effects, a diamond of analgesia. The quest was rooted in a specific chemical lineage. During the war, German chemists, cut off from the global supply of opium poppies, had managed to synthesize a drug called meperidine, known commercially as Demerol. It was the first true synthetic opioid, a proof of concept that pain relief could be manufactured without the help of a flower. But meperidine was imperfect. It was weak, it was short-lived, and it carried a toxic baggage that could cause seizures. Janssen looked at the structure of meperidine not as a failure, but as a rough draft. He saw the potential hidden within its carbon rings. Picture the scene in the laboratory. It is late at night. The rest of the town of Beerse is asleep, the fog rolling off the canal to blanket the streets. Inside, the lights hum. The air smells of ethanol, of acetate, of the sharp, acrid tang of chemical reactions. Janssen stands over a workbench covered in papers. He is not looking at the liquid in a flask. He is looking at a drawing. In those days, before computer modeling, the chemist had to hallucinate the molecule in 3 dimensions. He had to close his eyes and see the atoms spinning, see the electron clouds, feel the tension in the bonds. He manipulated atoms like a master watchmaker placing the tiniest gears into a chronometer. He was engaged in a process known as structural activity relationship. It is a game of microscopic consequences. If you remove a carbon atom here, does the drug become stronger? If you add a nitrogen bridge there, does it become toxic? It was a patient, obsessive labor, a conversation with the fundamental laws of matter. He was trying to build a structure that would slide through the fat of the brain, cross the blood-brain barrier like a ghost passing through a wall, and dock perfectly into the mu opioid receptor. The receptor. Let us visualize this ancient biological mechanism. On the surface of the nerve cells in our brains and spines, there are tiny protein-based ports. These are the locks. For millions of years, they waited for the body's own endorphins or for the accidental key of the poppy's morphine. But morphine was a clumsy key. It rattled in the lock. It was large, bulky, and it triggered other things: nausea, itching, histamine release, while it turned the lock of pain relief. Janssen wanted a laser-cut key. He wanted a molecule that was stripped of all unnecessary weight, a molecule that was pure function. For months, the work continued. The team in Beerse synthesized hundreds of compounds, each a slight variation of the last. They were explorers in a dark jungle, hacking away the undergrowth, looking for the path. There were failures. There were compounds that did nothing. There were compounds that were too toxic. But with each failure, the map became clearer. Janssen possessed an intuition that bordered on the supernatural. He could look at a 2D drawing and predict how the molecule would fold in the 3D wetness of the human body. He began to focus on the papyridine ring, the central skeleton of the molecule. He elongated the chain. He added a phenethyl group, a specific arrangement of carbon and hydrogen that seemed to act as a turbocharger for the molecule's affinity to the receptor. He was sculpting. He was refining. He was chiseling away the marble to reveal the angel within. Then came the year 1960. The world was on the precipice of a new decade. The Beatles were forming in Liverpool. Kennedy was running for president. The space race was igniting. And in Beerse, the synthesis was complete. The compound was coded R4263. It sat in a small glass vial, a dusting of white crystalline powder. To the naked eye, it looked no different than sugar or salt. It was unassuming, silent, and still. But within that lattice of crystals lay a power that defied comprehension. When they tested it, the results were so staggering that the scientists initially believed they had made a mistake. They ran the standard test, the tail flick test on mice, measuring how long the animal could withstand a heat source before reacting. With morphine, the reaction time slowed down. With this new compound, the reaction time stopped. Janssen and his team realized they had created something that possessed a potency 100 times greater than morphine. 100 times. Let us pause to feel the weight of that number. It is not merely a statistic, it is a change in the nature of reality. If morphine is a heavy, warm blanket, this new molecule was a lead shield. If morphine is a whisper of sleep, this was the silence of the void. It bound to the receptors with a ferocity that was almost gravitational. It grabbed the pain signals and crushed them into nothingness. Janssen named it fentanyl. The name itself sounds sharp, precise, modern. It lacks the floral softness of opium or the mythological grandeur of morphine. Fentanyl sounds like what it is, a product of the industrial age, a tool of precision engineering. In the hands of Dr. Paul Janssen, the genie had been bottled. But let us be clear about the intent. This was not created as a vice. It was not created for the street. It was created as an act of profound mercy. Janssen saw the cardiac patients, the frail elderly, the trauma victims whose hearts could not withstand the heavy dosing of weaker anesthetics. He saw that with fentanyl, an anesthesiologist could use a microscopic amount of speck of dust to achieve total pain control. This meant less strain on the organs, a faster recovery, a cleaner waking. It was the white dress of medicine. It was pure, sterile, and benevolent. The molecule was lipophilicity, loved fat. This meant it could dissolve instantly into the lipid-rich environment of the brain. It struck fast. There was no long, nauseating onset. It was there, and then it was gone. It was designed to be the perfect surgical tool, a scalpel made of chemistry. In the quiet of the Beerse laboratory, holding that first vial, Dr. Janssen could not have seen the long shadow that would stretch from that moment into the 21st century. He could not have seen the empty eyes of addicts in cities that had not yet been built. He could not have heard the sirens that would one day wail in response to his invention. He saw only the triumph of the intellect over the cruelty of biology. He saw a way to stop the screaming. The synthesis of fentanyl was the high watermark of modern pharmaceutical chemistry. It was the moment when humanity finally surpassed the poppy. We had looked at the flower, with its rain-dependent cycles and its inconsistent latex, and we had said, "We can do better." We had taken the chaotic organic soup of nature and distilled it into a single, razor-sharp equation. But there is a tragedy in perfection. Nature, for all its flaws, imposes limits. The poppy requires land. It requires time. It has a bulk that makes it difficult to transport in massive quantities. The synthetic molecule requires only precursors and knowledge. It has no physical limits. It is an idea made manifest, and ideas are impossible to contain. The news of the discovery traveled from Beerse to the great medical centers of the world. Anesthesiologists were astounded. Here was a drug that allowed for cardiac stability, the ability to keep a patient completely under without depressing their heart rate to dangerous levels. It made open-heart surgery safer. It made long, complex operations viable. For the man on the operating table, terrified and vulnerable, fentanyl was the hand of God reaching down to suspend time and sensation. As the 1960s progressed, fentanyl began to enter the hospitals. It was treated with the utmost reverence. It was kept in double-locked safes, accounted for down to the microgram. It was the nuclear energy of the medical world, immensely powerful, capable of miraculous things, but demanding absolute respect and control. Dr. Janssen continued his work, creating a dynasty of medicines. He was a man who worked until the very end, driven by the belief that there are still so many diseases to be cured. He was a humanitarian scientist, a man who undoubtedly saved millions of lives through his inventions. But the story of fentanyl is the story of a tool that outgrew its master. It is the story of a key that was so perfect, so universal, that it eventually unlocked doors that were meant to stay forever closed. As we leave the orderly town of Beerse, with its brick factories and its quiet canals, we must carry with us this image. The genius standing amidst the glass, the rain falling softly outside, holding a vial of white powder that contains enough silence to quiet a city. The wind shifts. The era of the botanical is over. The era of the synthetic has begun. And in the dark, coiled structure of that new molecule, the future is waiting, silent and potent, ready to be unleashed upon a world that is not yet ready for the magnitude of its power. We move now from the laboratory to the theater of its application, to the bright lights and the sterile tiles where the molecule would earn its reputation as the supreme guardian of the threshold between consciousness and oblivion. The alchemist has finished his work. Now, the physicians must take up the burden of the cure. The architecture of the invisible. Let us deepen our gaze into the very nature of this architectural design that Janssen pioneered. To say he manipulated atoms is true, but it lacks the visceral poetry of the reality. Imagine a cathedral builder in the Middle Ages, knowing that the placement of a single keystone keeps the entire vault from collapsing. Janssen was working with forces far more temperamental than stone. He was working with electronegativity, with the van der Waals forces, with the ghostly attraction and repulsion of electron clouds. The lock and key metaphor, while useful, is perhaps too mechanical for the fluid dance of biology. It is more like a hand slipping into a glove. The receptor is the glove, a complex folded protein embedded in the cell membrane. It has pockets and crevices, specific electrical charges lining its interior. The morphine molecule was a stiff, leather hand-it fit, but it was tight in places, loose in others. It required force. The fentanyl molecule, by contrast, was a hand made of silk. It was flexible. It could twist and rotate, finding the path of least resistance. The addition of the nitrogen bridge, that crucial modification, acted like a hinge, allowing the molecule to conform perfectly to the shape of the receptor's deepest pocket. This is the terrible beauty of high-affinity chemistry. When fentanyl binds to the mu-opioid receptor, it triggers a cascade of intracellular events that is absolute. It opens potassium channels, allowing positive charge to flow out of the cell. It closes calcium channels, preventing the neurotransmitters of pain, substance P, glutamate, from being released. It is a biological mute button. In the 1950s, this level of understanding was just dawning. Janssen was working on the edge of the known world. Every experiment was a message in a bottle cast into the dark ocean of physiology, waiting for a reply. When the reply finally came in the form of the successful synthesis, it was a validation of the human intellect's ability to decode the cipher of life. But in the quiet of Beerse, there was also a humility. Janssen knew that he was tinkering with the machinery of the soul. To take away pain is a godlike power. Pain is the primary signal of life. To extinguish it so completely is to bring the living body to the very edge of death. The safety margin, the therapeutic index, was the holy grail. With morphine, the dose that stopped pain was uncomfortably close to the dose that stopped breathing. Janssen hoped that fentanyl, with its precision, would widen that gap. And for a time, it seemed he had succeeded. The landscape of recovery. Let us look outside the laboratory window again. The post-war world was a world in pain. There were millions of veterans carrying shrapnel in their bodies, carrying the phantom pains of lost limbs. There was a generation of cancer patients for whom the end of life was a tunnel of agony. The existing drugs were simply not enough. They were blunt instruments that left patients groggy, constipated, and still hurting. Janssen's motivation was deeply empathetic. He did not want to create a product. He wanted to create a solution. He saw the suffering of the world not as a philosophical necessity, but as a biological problem to be solved. In the orderly brick streets of Beerse, he dreamed of a world where pain was optional. The synthesis of fentanyl was, in many ways, the apex of the modernist dream. It was the belief that, through science, we could scrub away the rough edges of existence. We could create a smooth, frictionless life. We could conquer infection with antibiotics, conquer distance with jet fuel, and conquer pain with opioids. But just as the splitting of the atom revealed the dual nature of energy, capable of powering a city or destroying it, the synthesis of the super-opioid revealed the dual nature of pharmacology. By creating a substance that mimicked the body's own pleasure and relief systems so perfectly, Janssen had inadvertently created a competitor to the human spirit. The molecule was clean, it was pure, it was efficient. It was everything the post-war world aspired to be. It reflected the clean lines of mid-century architecture, the efficient bureaucracy of the new European Union, the streamlined aerodynamics of the new cars. It was a modern drug for modern man, and yet, it acted on the most ancient part of the brain. It bypassed the neocortex, the seat of reason and logic, and spoke directly to the brainstem, the lizard brain, the seat of breath and instinct. It was a futuristic key opening a prehistoric lock. The bottle and the genie. The phrase, "the genie is out of the bottle," is often used, but its origins in Arabian mythology, the jinn are telling. The jinn are creatures of smokeless fire, powerful, capricious, and bound to grant wishes that often carry a terrible, ironic price. Dr. Janssen bottled the gin in 1960. He placed the stopper in the vial. He labeled it with a code and then a name. He handed it to the medical community with instructions. Use this for mercy. Use this to shield the vulnerable. For decades, the jinn obeyed. It stayed in the lamp. It stayed in the operating theater. It hovered over the open chests of bypass patients, keeping them still and serene. It floated in the spinal fluid of mothers undergoing C-sections, allowing them to witness the birth of their children without the screaming agony of the scalpel. It was a golden age of control. The doctors were the masters, and the molecule was the servant. But chemistry is information. And information, like water, wants to be free. The formula for fentanyl, the arrangement of carbons, hydrogens, nitrogens, and oxygens, was published. It was patented. It sat in the libraries of universities. It was a secret, hidden in plain sight. The alchemist of Beerse had done his work too well. He had made the process too efficient. He had proven that you did not need a field of poppies to create Oblivion. You only needed a few precursor chemicals and a working knowledge of organic synthesis. As the sun sets on the 1950s and the turbulent 60s begin to churn, we leave Dr. Paul Janssen in his moment of triumph. He is a hero of medicine, a titan of relief. But the silence of the countryside around him is deceptive. The wind is picking up. The molecule is leaving the safety of the village. It is beginning its long journey through the bloodstream of history. It is a journey that will take it from the sterile sanctuary of the clinic to the chaotic despair of the street. It is a journey that will turn the miracle into a massacre. But here, in the beginning, there's only the quiet satisfaction of the puzzle solved, the lock opened, and the promise of a pain-free world shimmering like a mirage in the bottom of a glass beaker. The synthetic silence has been born. To understand the true magnitude of the change that had occurred in the quiet laboratory of Beerse, we must leave the realm of brick and mortar, of rain-swept streets and glass vials. We must abandon the macroscopic world entirely. We must shrink down, smaller than the eye of a needle, smaller than the grain of sand, smaller even than the single cell of the poppy flower. We must descend into the subatomic cathedral of the human body, a universe as vast and as complex as the star-filled firmament above us. Let us pause to visualize the invisible. Imagine floating in a warm, dark current, a river of life that pulses with a rhythmic, hydraulic beat. This is the bloodstream, the ancient waterway of the organism. Around us, red blood cells drift like red rubber rafts, carrying their cargo of oxygen to the distant shores of the limbs and organs. White blood cells, the soldiers of the immune system, patrol the currents like silent leviathans, watching for intruders. But we are looking for something smaller, something that does not belong in this biological ecosystem. We are tracking a ghost. This ghost is the fentanyl molecule. If we could see it with the eyes of a physicist, it would appear as a geometric sculpture, a precise arrangement of spheres floating in the void. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, the fundamental building blocks of the universe locked together in a specific, rigid dance. It is a structure of elegance and terror. Unlike the chaotic, sprawling molecules of nature, which often carry unnecessary atoms like baggage, this synthetic creation is streamlined. It is aerodynamic. It is designed for one purpose: to travel. Its destination is the fortress of the human brain. For millions of years, evolution has worked tirelessly to protect the brain. It is the seat of consciousness, the throne room of the soul, and as such, it is guarded by the most formidable wall in biology, the blood-brain barrier. Picture this barrier not as a wall of stone, but as a tightly woven mesh of endothelial cells lining the capillaries that feed the brain. These cells are stitched together so closely that not even water can pass freely. It is a checkpoint, a gatekeeper that stands with a flaming sword, denying entry to bacteria, to viruses, and to most poisons that we might ingest from the chaotic world outside. Morphine, the old king of pain relief, struggles at this gate. Morphine is hydrophilic. It loves water. It dissolves beautifully in the blood, but when it reaches the oily, fatty ramparts of the blood-brain barrier, it is repelled. It knocks politely at the door of the nervous system. It requires time, high concentrations, and a certain biological luck to cross over. It is a guest that must wait to be invited. But fentanyl is different, and in this difference lies the architecture of Oblivion. The fentanyl molecule is a masterpiece of lipophilicity. In the language of chemistry, lipophilic means fat-loving. The human brain is, in essence, a magnificent structure of lipids fats. The myelin sheaths that insulate our nerves, the membranes of the neurons themselves, the gray and white matter, it is all a rich, oily landscape. Fentanyl does not see the blood-brain barrier as a wall, it sees it as an open door. Because it loves fat, it dissolves into the membrane of the barrier as easily as a drop of oil dissolves into butter. It is a ghost walking through walls. There is no knocking, there is no waiting. The molecule slips through the tight junctions of the endothelial cells with a terrifying ease. It glides from the blood into the brain tissue in a matter of seconds. It is an invasion that happens in silence, a stealth bomber slipping under the radar of the body's ancient defenses. One moment the brain is alert, processing the signals of the world, the light, the sound, the pain, and the next, the ghost has arrived. Once inside the citadel of the brain, the molecule seeks its partner. It is looking for the mu-opioid receptor. Let us visualize this receptor. Protruding from the surface of the nerve cells, like lilies floating on a pond, are complex protein structures. These are the G-protein-coupled receptors. They are the ears of the cell, listening for chemical messages from the body. They wait for endorphins, the body's natural painkillers, to tell them to calm down, to soothe the system after a run or a fight. The shape of the mu receptor is specific. It has pockets and grooves, a three-dimensional lock waiting for a key. Morphine fits this lock, but it is a loose fit. It rattles. It takes many morphine molecules to turn the lock fully. Fentanyl, however, fits with a mathematical precision that borders on the supernatural. It was designed by Dr. Janssen to match the negative space of the receptor perfectly. When the fentanyl molecule approaches the receptor, the forces of attraction, the van der Waals forces, pull it in with a tenacity that is almost gravitational. It is a seduction of the cellular biology. The molecule slides into the pocket of the receptor. It clicks into place. And in that moment of binding, a profound signal is sent deep into the heart of the neuron. This is the moment of silencing. To understand the silence, we must understand the noise. Pain, at its most fundamental level, is electricity. It is a frantic, high-frequency signal screaming along the nerves. When a scalpel cuts skin or a bone breaks, the nerves at the site of the injury open their floodgates. Sodium ions rush into the cells, creating a spark, an action potential. This spark jumps from nerve to nerve, a relay race of agony, racing up the spinal cord and crashing into the thalamus and the cortex of the brain. "Damage!" it screams. "Danger! Hurt!" It is a choir of sirens wailing in the night. When fentanyl binds to the receptor, it changes the rules of physics within the cell. It commands the neuron to open its potassium channels. Positive charge flows out of the cell. The cell becomes hyperpolarized. In poetic terms, the cell becomes heavy. It becomes tired. It becomes harder for the spark of pain to ignite. The threshold for firing is raised so high that the scream of the nerves cannot reach it. Simultaneously, the molecule commands the calcium channels to close. Calcium is the fuel that allows the pain signal to jump the gap between nerves, the synapse. By blocking the calcium, fentanyl cuts the bridge. The runner in the relay race reaches out with the baton of pain, but there is no one there to take it. The message dies in the gap. The choir of sirens does not just get quieter, it is silenced. The conductor drops the baton. The electricity fades. The alarm system of the body, evolved over hundreds of millions of years to keep us safe from predators and fire, is dismantled by a microscopic geometric shape. In those early days of discovery, in the 1960s and 70s, this architecture was viewed with absolute awe. It was not seen as a curse, but as a miracle of engineering. The medical community looked at this synthetic silence and saw a solution to the most intractable problems of surgery. We must transport ourselves now to the operating theaters of the 1970s. The air is cold and smells of antiseptic. The lights are bright and shadowless. On the table lies a patient with a failing heart. This is the era of the great pioneers of cardiac surgery. They are attempting things that were once thought impossible, replacing valves, bypassing clogged arteries, stopping the heart itself to repair it. But there was a problem. The human body does not want to be cut open. Even when unconscious under ether or morphine, the body knows it is being assaulted. The autonomic nervous system reacts. The heart rate spikes. The blood pressure skyrockets. The body floods with adrenaline, fighting for survival on a primal level. For a patient with a weak heart, this stress response was often fatal. The trauma of the surgery would kill them before the surgeon could finish. Enter fentanyl. Anesthesiologists began to experiment with what they called high-dose fentanyl anesthesia. They realized that because the drug was so clean, so specific to the pain receptors, they could administer massive doses that would stop the breathing of a herd of elephants, and the patient's heart would remain perfectly stable. Picture the scene. The anesthesiologist injects the clear liquid into the IV line. It travels up the arm, through the heart, and into the brain. It crosses the barrier instantly. It binds to the receptors. The effect is a total disconnection of the soul from the trauma of the flesh. The surgeon takes the scalpel and makes the incision, cutting through the sternum. In a normal body, this would trigger a volcanic eruption of stress hormones. But under the blanket of fentanyl, the body is silent. The heart rate does not flutter. The blood pressure does not rise. The patient floats in a deep, gray ocean of non-existence. They are suspended in a state of pure mathematical peace. The molecule acts as a synthetic blanket of snow. Imagine a jagged, rocky mountain range, the peaks of pain, the cliffs of trauma. Now imagine a heavy, thick snowfall covering it all. The rocks are still there, underneath, but the surface is smooth, white, and silent. The sled of the surgery glides over it without a bump. It allowed the surgeons to work with the precision of watchmakers. They could stop the heart, put the patient on a bypass machine, sew the delicate vessels, and restart the heart, all while the patient's nervous system remained in a state of suspended animation. It was a triumph of pharmacology. It saved thousands of lives. It allowed grandfathers to see their grandchildren graduate. It allowed mothers to survive complications that would have killed them a decade earlier. This was the benevolent face of the architecture. The molecule was a guardian. It was a shield against the brutality of biology. And unlike the older drugs, fentanyl was designed to vanish. This is the final piece of its architectural genius: redistribution. Because the molecule loves fat so much, it does not stay in the brain forever. After the initial flood, after the receptors are saturated and the surgery is done, the molecule begins to drift away. It is pulled out of the brain and into the other fatty tissues of the body, the muscles, the skin, the storage fat. It leaves the command center. The patient wakes up. The waking is often described as smooth, unlike the hungover, nauseous grogginess of ether or heavy morphine. One moment they are in the void, and the next they are back in the room, the lights humming, the nurse smiling. The pain is manageable. The trauma has occurred, but the memory of the body has been wiped clean. This quality, the speed of onset and the speed of offset, made it the perfect drug for the modern age. It was efficient. It fit the schedule of the hospital. It was a drug that respected the clock. But in this perfection lay the seeds of the coming darkness. The very attributes that made it a miracle in the operating room, its lipophilicity, its potency, its ability to cross the blood-brain barrier like a ghost, its intense, euphoric silencing of the world, were the exact attributes that would make it a destroyer in the streets. The lock and key analogy assumes that only the doctor holds the key. But once a key is forged, it can be copied. And once the body learns that such a silence is possible, that there is a chemical switch that can turn off not just physical pain, but emotional pain, existential pain, the pain of simply being alive, the body begins to crave the silence. The mu-opioid receptor is not just about pain. It is also part of the reward system. When fentanyl binds, it triggers a release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center of the brain. But pleasure is too small a word for what fentanyl provides. A chocolate bar gives pleasure. A lover's touch gives pleasure. Fentanyl gives oblivion. It offers a complete cessation of struggle. For a human species that is defined by struggle, the struggle for food, for love, for status, for meaning, the offer of total, instant peace is the ultimate seduction. It is the song of the sirens, calling the sailor to crash his ship against the rocks, promising that the water is warm and the sleep is sweet. Dr. Janssen had built a cathedral of silence. He had constructed it with the bricks of carbon and the mortar of nitrogen. He had designed it to be a sanctuary for the sick, but he had inadvertently built a tomb. As we float back up from the microscopic level, leaving the dancing atoms and the quieting neurons, we return to the surface of the skin. We see the patient sleeping peacefully. We see the monitor beeping rhythmically. We see the triumph of medicine. But we also see the fragility of the barrier that separates us from the void. We have engineered a way to turn off the light of consciousness with a single grain of dust. And having found the switch, we are now faced with the terrifying temptation to flick it, again and again, until the light does not come back on. The architecture of Oblivion is complete. The walls are strong, the roof is sound, the ghost is in the machine. And as the decades roll forward, the ghost will begin to hunger for more than just the pain of the surgical patient. It will hunger for the pain of the world. Let us move forward in time to see how this perfect molecule, this silent guardian, began to shed its white medical dress and put on the dark cloak of the commodity. The laboratory is behind us, the hospital is around us, but the door is opening and the cool air of the street is blowing in. History often wears a disguise. Sometimes it comes in the armor of a conqueror, stained with the mud of the battlefield. Sometimes it wears the rags of the prophet, crying out in the wilderness. But for the molecule born in Beerse, history wore a white dress. It was a garment of starch and linen, spotless and crisp, moving silently through the corridors of the world's most trusted institutions. For decades, the ghost that Dr. Janssen had summoned lived strictly within the sanctuary. It was not a creature of the alleyways or the nightclubs. It was a resident of the high temple of modernity, the hospital. To understand this era, we must reconstruct the atmosphere of the late 20th century medical world. It was a time of immense, almost religious faith in the power of the institution. Science had split the atom, it had gone to the moon, and now it was conquering the final frontier of human frailty. Picture, if you will, the operating theater of the 1970s. It is a space defined by a specific, hallowed quality of light-a-bright, shadowless illumination that falls from great circular lamps, bathing the room in a clarity that does not exist in nature. The air is cool, filtered, and smells faintly of metallic ozone and the sharp, clean scent of iodine. The sounds are rhythmic and subdued, the metronomic beep of the cardiac monitor, like a digital heartbeat, the soft hiss of the ventilator bellows rising and falling, the quiet, purposeful murmurs of the nurses, the clink of stainless steel on a tray. In this controlled ecosystem, fentanyl was the high priest. It was the white dress of medicine, a respected, controlled, and feared. It was the liquid courage in the anesthesiologist's syringe, a clear, colorless fluid that held the power to suspend the laws of human suffering. The anesthesiologist is the unsung navigator of the medical seas. While the surgeon is the captain, cutting and mending, the anesthesiologist is the one who guides the ship through the storm. They stand at the head of the table, watching the monitors, watching the eyes of the patient, balancing the chemistry of the blood against the trauma of the knife. In the 1970s, their toolkit was transformed by the arrival of Janssen's molecule. Before fentanyl, anesthesia was often a rough voyage. Ether and chloroform were explosive and sickening. Morphine was heavy and slow, leaving patients groggy for days, their bowels seized, their breathing shallow. But fentanyl was different. It was the liquid grace. Imagine a patient lying on the table, perhaps a steelworker with a shattered spine, or a child with a hole in their heart. They are terrified. Their adrenaline is surging, their heart beating like a trapped bird against the ribs. The anesthesiologist leans in, a figure of calm behind a mask. They inject a small amount of the drug into the intravenous line. The effect is not a bludgeoning, it is a lifting. The patient does not feel themselves falling asleep so much as they feel the weight of the world simply evaporating. The fear dissolves. The pain, if it is there, vanishes like mist in the morning sun. They are guided gently, swiftly, into the deep, dreamless waters of the induced coma. It is a mercy so profound that it feels almost spiritual. In these bright, sterile rooms, fentanyl was the guardian of the threshold. It stood between life and death, holding the door open just wide enough for the surgeon to enter, but keeping the darkness at bay. It allowed the body to endure insults that would otherwise kill it. When a chest is cracked open, when a skull is drilled, the body screams. It wants to go into shock. It wants to shut down. Fentanyl whispers to the brainstem, "All is well. There is no danger here. Sleep." And the brain obeys. The leverage of science over sensation in this era was absolute. We must marvel at the mathematics of it. In the pharmacy of the hospital, fentanyl was measured not in grams nor in milligrams, but in micrograms. A microgram is 1/1,000,000th of a gram. To visualize this, imagine a single grain of table salt. Now imagine cutting that grain of salt into 1,000 pieces. One of those pieces is roughly a microgram. Such was the power of the molecule that a few hundred of these invisible specks could sedate a grown man, a linebacker, a soldier. It was a density of power that rivaled plutonium. A tiny vial, no larger than a thumb, contained enough stillness to silence an entire ward. This potency demanded a culture of extreme discipline. In the 1970s and 80s, fentanyl was kept in the narcotics cabinet, a double-locked steel box bolted to the wall of the nursing station. The keys were carried by the charge nurse, worn around the neck like a talisman. Every drop had to be accounted for. If a vial was broken, witnesses had to sign a log. If a dose was given, it was recorded in ink. It was a substance that commanded respect. The medical staff knew that they were handling a loaded weapon. They knew that the difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose was a matter of decimal points. But they also knew that without it, modern medicine would grind to a halt. This was the golden age of pharmaceutical promise. It was a time when the intent was purely, transparently, to heal. There was no cynicism yet, no shadow of the epidemic that was to come. The drug was seen as a gift to the weary traveler on their journey through the fragility of the human condition. Let us travel from the operating theater to the battlefield. The 1960s and 70s were scarred by the war in Vietnam. Here, in the humidity of the jungle, amidst the roar of helicopters and the chaos of the triage tents, fentanyl began to find its place as an angel of mercy for the fallen. The morphine syrettes of World War II were still in use, but for the most severe trauma burns, the multiple amputations, the doctors in the field hospitals turned to the new, potent synthetic. Imagine a soldier, young and broken, lying on a cot in a MASH unit. The pain is a universe of its own, a white-hot, blinding reality that erases all thought, all hope. The medic administers the drug. Within seconds, the universe of pain collapses. The soldier's breathing slows. The screams stop. A look of distant, detached peace settles over the face. It is not that the injury is gone, it is that it no longer matters. The drug has severed the emotional connection to the agony. It has granted dignity where there was only terror. This concept of dignity is central to the history of the white dress. Pain is dehumanizing. It reduces the philosopher, the father, the artist, into a whimpering animal. By conquering pain so completely, fentanyl restored the humanity of the sufferer. We see this most poignantly in the oncology wards. In the late 20th century, cancer treatment was often brutal, and the disease itself was a slow, grinding thief of life. For patients in the final stages, the terminal phase, the pain could be relentless. It was a bone-deep ache that never slept. Here, fentanyl moved from the syringe to the slow-release patch. This was a technological leap that brought the white dress out of the surgery and onto the skin. The transdermal patch was a small, adhesive square, innocent in appearance. But inside, It held a reservoir of the drug, designed to seep slowly through the dermis, into the capillaries, and up to the brain over the course of 72 hours. For the dying, this was a revolution. It meant they did not need to be pricked with needles every 4 hours. It meant they could go home. They could sit in their own armchairs, surrounded by their books and their families. The patch provided a floor of pain relief, a constant, steady silence that kept the agony at bay. Picture a grandmother in the late 1980s. She is frail, her skin like parchment. She is wearing a fentanyl patch on her shoulder, hidden beneath her cardigan. Because of this patch, she is able to knit. She is able to hold a cup of tea without her hands shaking from the effort of enduring pain. She is able to have a lucid conversation with her grandson, to tell him stories of the past, rather than being lost in a fog of suffering. In this context, fentanyl was love. It was the highest expression of compassion that chemistry could offer. It was the scientific equivalent of holding someone's hand in the dark. It allowed the dying to leave the world with grace, rather than in a paroxysm of torture. This era of the white dress was defined by trust. The patient trusted the doctor trusted the pharmaceutical company, the company trusted the science. It was a closed loop of benevolence. The molecule was a tool, and tools are morally neutral. They take on the intent of the hand that wields them. In the hands of the oncologist, the anesthesiologist, the palliative care nurse, fentanyl was a saint. But saints are often martyrs, and purity is easily corrupted. Even in this golden age, there were whispers of the shadow. Anesthesiologists, those guardians of the sleep, were the first to fall. They had access. They had the stress of a job where a single mistake meant death. They knew the feeling of the white dress, the way it smoothed out the jagged edges of reality. In the quiet break rooms of hospitals, stories began to circulate. A brilliant doctor found slumped in the on-call room a syringe on the floor. A nurse who wore long sleeves in the summer to hide the track marks. These were isolated tragedies, viewed as occupational hazards, like a radiologist getting too much radiation. They were not seen as harbingers of a societal collapse. The drug was still contained. It was trapped behind the walls of the institution. To get it, you had to be part of the priesthood of medicine. You had to wear the white coat. You had to know the secret language of Latin prescriptions and physiology. The public knew nothing of fentanyl. It was not a word on the evening news. It was not a lyric in a rap song. It was a ghost that lived in the machine of healthcare, invisible to the average citizen. If you asked a man on the street in 1985 what fentanyl was, he would stare at you blankly. He knew heroin, he knew cocaine, he knew marijuana, but he did not know the name of the silence that was waiting in the wings. The pharmaceutical companies, seeing the success of the drug, began to refine it further. They developed lozenges, lollipops, on a stick for breakthrough cancer pain. The idea was brilliant. The mucous membranes of the mouth absorb drugs instantly. If a patient had a sudden spike of pain, they could swirl the lozenge and find relief in moments. Again, the intent was mercy. But in creating these new user-friendly forms, the patch, the lollipop, the industry was inadvertently preparing the drug for a different market. They were taking the liquid courage out of the syringe and putting it into forms that looked like candy, like Band-Aids, like everyday objects. They were domesticating the wolf. The white dress era was also a time of scientific hubris. We believed we had mastered the biology of pain. We thought we could separate the analgesic effects of opioids from their addictive properties. We told ourselves that pain acts as an antagonist to addiction, that if a patient was truly in pain, they would not get hooked. This was a comforting lie, a myth that allowed doctors to prescribe with a clear conscience. We did not yet fully understand the deep, ancient rewiring that happens in the brain when the mu-opioid receptor is flooded with a superagonist like fentanyl. We did not see that the brain, in its desperate attempt to maintain equilibrium, was fighting back, stripping away its own receptors, demanding more and more of the drug just to feel normal. We saw the peace on the face of the patient, and we called it healing. We did not see the hunger growing in the neurons. So, let us remember this time with a complex nostalgia. It was a time when the monster was a servant. It was a time when the most dangerous chemical on earth was used solely to bring comfort to the dying and safety to the surgical patient. There is a specific beauty to the hospital at night. The corridors are dim. The city outside is a blur of lights through the window. Inside, there is a hush. In room 302, a man recovering from a heart transplant sleeps deeply, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm dictated by the lingering ghost of the anesthesia. He is alive because of the skill of the surgeon, yes, but also because of the silence of the fentanyl that held him still while his heart was stopped. In room 415, a woman with bone cancer sleeps, a small patch on her arm delivering a microscopic stream of relief. She is dreaming of her childhood garden. She is not screaming. This is the legacy of the white dress. It is a legacy of compassion. It is the memory of the molecule before it fell from grace. It is the calm before the storm. But outside the hospital walls, the world was changing. The chemistry of the street was becoming more ruthless. The demand for highs was evolving, and the knowledge of how to make this synthetic ghost was beginning to leak. The patent on Janssen's invention would not last forever. The recipe was in the books. The white dress was about to be stained. The sterile sanctuary was about to be breached. The tool of mercy was about to become a weapon of mass destruction. But for now, in the stillness of the 1970s operating theater, let us hold on to the image of the healer. The anesthesiologist checks the flow of the IV. The monitor beeps. Beep. Beep, beep, a steady, reassuring rhythm. The patient is safe. The pain is gone. The silence is golden. The molecule is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is washing away the sins of the flesh with the waters of oblivion. The ritual of the count. Within the white dress era, there existed a sacred ritual known to every nurse and pharmacist, the count. At the changing of every shift, usually at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., the outgoing nurse and the incoming nurse would stand together before the narcotics cabinet. It was a ceremony as old as the regulations themselves. One nurse would hold the keys, the other the ledger. They would open the heavy steel door. Inside, rows of ampules and vials sat in orderly plastic bins. They would count them aloud, their voices low and serious. Fentanyl, 100 micrograms, 2 milliliters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, full box. Check. Morphine, 10 milligrams, 1, 2. This ritual was the firewall. It was the acknowledgement that these substances possessed a gravity that aspirin and antibiotics did not. It was a daily reverence paid to the power of the poppy and its synthetic children. If the count was off even by a single vial, the doors of the unit were locked. No one went home. Security was called. The trash was searched. This obsession with control highlights just how potent fentanyl was viewed. It was not treated like a medicine. It was treated like a controlled substance in the nuclear sense. The waste, the leftover amount in a syringe after a patient had been dosed, had to be squirted out in the presence of a witness, often into a specific chemical sink or a sharps container, and signed for. Wasted 50 micrograms, witnessed by Jane Doe, RN. The language is telling. Wasted. As if throwing away this silence was a sin or a danger. This strict containment created a false sense of security. We believed that because we counted the vials, we controlled the molecule. We believed that because the walls of the hospital were thick, the ghost could not escape. We failed to realize that the walls of the hospital are porous. People walk in and out, doctors, nurses, patients, janitors. And ideas, the idea of a synthetic, undetectable, super-potent high, walk through walls easiest of all. The architecture of mercy. Let us deepen our appreciation for the medical utility of this substance. In the white dress era, fentanyl solved a specific physiological riddle known as the stress response to trauma. When a human body is subjected to major surgery, say, the replacement of a hip joint or the removal of a lung, the nervous system panics. Even if the patient is unconscious, the primitive brain screams. It releases cortisol, catecholamines, adrenaline. It clamps down the blood vessels. It forces the heart to beat wildly. This storm consumes vast amounts of oxygen and energy. For a frail patient, this storm alone could be fatal. They might survive the surgery but die of exhaustion on the table. Fentanyl was the anti-storm. Because of its unique affinity for the mu receptors in the brainstem, it could block this stress response almost completely. It severed the link between the knife and the adrenal gland. It allowed for what was called stress-free anesthesia. The patient would lie there, chest open, and their vitals would be as calm as if they were sleeping in their own bed on a Sunday morning. It was a physiological miracle. It allowed surgeons to operate on premature infants, whose tiny hearts could not handle the stress of pain. It allowed them to operate on 90-year-olds. It expanded the boundaries of what was surgically possible. In this light, fentanyl was not a destroyer, it was a builder. It built the modern capability of critical care medicine. It allowed us to fix the unfixable. The white dress it wore was deserved. It earned its place in the WHO model list of essential medicines. It was, and remains, a cornerstone of global health. If you are in a car accident today, anywhere in the developed world, and you are brought to a trauma bay with shattered legs, the first mercy you will receive is likely a dose of fentanyl. It will arrive in your blood like a cool hand on a fevered brow. The transition of form. As the era progressed into the 1990s, the form of the molecule began to shift. The transdermal patch, introduced under the brand name Duragesic, was a marvel of membrane technology. It was a clear, rectangular reservoir containing a gel of fentanyl and alcohol. A semi-permeable membrane controlled the rate of release. It was designed for chronic pain, pain that lasted a long time. Back pain, cancer pain, neuropathic pain. This was the first time fentanyl was allowed to leave the hospital in large numbers. Patients took boxes of patches home. This was the crack in the dam. The patch was intended to be tamper-proof. You were supposed to wear it, not eat it or inject it. But the ingenuity of the addict and the curiosity of the desperate is infinite. People discovered that the gel inside the patch could be extracted. They found that if you cut the patch open and ate the gel, you received a massive, potentially lethal dose all at once. Or, if you heated it, you could inhale the vapor. The white dress was beginning to fray. The medicine that was safe when titrated by a Harvard-trained anesthesiologist became a game of Russian roulette when manipulated in a suburban bedroom. But in the 1970s and 80s, this was still on the fringe. The dominant narrative was still one of medical triumph. The patch was a godsend for the cancer wards. It allowed patients to die with their families, not hooked up to IV poles. The cultural silence. There is a silence in the history books about this era of fentanyl. It is overshadowed by the louder drug wars of the time. The 1970s and 80s were the era of the heroin epidemic in New York, the crack epidemic in Los Angeles and Miami. The news was full of images of needles in parks and white powder in boardrooms. Fentanyl was absent from this noise. It was hiding in plain sight, protected by its medical legitimacy. It was not a street drug. It was too hard to make, too hard to get. It was the exclusive property of the White Coat Guild. This invisibility was its own kind of danger. Because it wasn't on the streets, law enforcement wasn't looking for it. Customs agents weren't testing for it. The dogs weren't trained to smell it. It was a phantom. And so, when the rogue chemists finally decided to break it out of the laboratory, the world was completely unprepared. We had spent billions fighting cocaine and heroin, the poppy and the coca leaf, but we had ignored the synthetic ghost. We had built walls to stop the plants, but we had left the door open for the chemicals. The twilight of innocence. As we close this chapter on the white dress of medicine, we stand at the end of the 20th century. The sun is setting on the era of innocent science. The belief that we could use these powerful molecules solely for good is about to be shattered. The operating theater is still bright, the monitor still beeps, but the shadows in the corners are lengthening. The molecule is restless. It is too powerful to be contained by a prescription pad. It is too profitable to be ignored by the underworld. The white dress is about to be traded for a shroud. But let us not forget the mercy. Let us not forget the millions of souls who were carried gently through the valleys of agony by this invisible boatman. In the grand ledger of history, fentanyl has a column of black and a column of red. The black column, the deaths, the addiction, is terrifyingly long. But the red column, the relief, the successful surgeries, the peaceful deaths, is also long. It is the dual nature of the pharmacon, the cure and the poison, the angel and the demon. They are the same molecule. The only difference is the context. The only difference is the intent. As the lights of the hospital dim and the night shift begins, the nurses count the vials one last time. 1, 2, 3, 4. All present, all accounted for. The beast is in its cage, for now. The wind outside is changing. A cold breeze is blowing from the east and from the clandestine basements of the west. The alchemist's dream is about to become the world's nightmare. The synthetic silence is about to grow loud. The history of medicine is a history of vessels. For centuries, the cure was carried in the clay jar, the glass vial, the porcelain mortar, and the steel syringe. These vessels were the tools of the initiated, the sacred objects of the healer's guild. To access the medicine, one needed the priest, the doctor, the nurse, the apothecary, to uncork the bottle or wield the needle. The power remained sequestered, held behind the heavy oak doors of the clinic or the double-locked steel of the hospital cabinet. But as the 20th century began to wane, drifting toward the millennium in a haze of technological optimism, the vessel changed. The molecule grew restless. It sought a new way to enter the blood, a path that did not require the sharp violence of the needle or the skilled hand of the surgeon. The ghost of Dr. Janssen's laboratory was about to leave the white dress behind and put on the casual clothes of domesticity. It was about to migrate from the sterile sanctuary of the operating theater to the cluttered, intimate warmth of the bedside table. This migration was driven by a noble and desperate innovation, a desire to conquer the one realm of suffering that the syringe could not touch, the realm of the chronic. Surgery is a storm. It is violent, intense, but finite. It has a beginning and an end. But chronic pain, the gnawing, grinding agony of terminal cancer, of crushed vertebrae, of nerve endings that fire without cause, is a climate. It is a season of winter that never turns to spring. For the sufferer of chronic pain, the needle is a poor comfort. It offers a spike of relief followed by a trough of returning agony, a roller coaster of sensation that exhausts the spirit. The medical world needed a way to smooth the waters. They needed a river of relief that flowed constantly, day and night, without ceasing. And so, in the quiet research centers of Palo Alto and Beerse, scientists began to look at the largest organ of the human body, the skin. For millennia, the skin was viewed as a fortress. It is the wall that separates the self from the world, a barrier of keratin and lipid designed to keep the ocean of the body in and the dangers of the environment out. It is waterproof, bacteria-proof, and remarkably resistant to chemical intrusion. To suggest that one could feed a drug through this armor was, for a long time, considered a biological impossibility. But the fentanyl molecule, with its unique architectural genius, held a secret key. Recall the lesson of the lipophilic. Fentanyl loves fat. The outer layer of our skin, the stratum corneum, is essentially a brick wall where the bricks are dead cells and the mortar is lipid fat. While water-based drugs bounce off this wall, fentanyl dissolves into the mortar. It sees the skin not as a barrier, but as a bridge. In 1990, after years of experimentation, the FDA approved a revolutionary device, the Duragesic transdermal patch. Let us visualize this object. It was deceptively simple. It looked like a clear, rectangular bandage, a piece of mundane plastic no larger than a playing card. It sat quietly in a foil pouch. There were no moving parts, no batteries, no needles, yet it was a marvel of membrane technology, a microscopic pump powered by the laws of physics alone. The patch was constructed in layers, like a geological stratification of chemistry. At the top was a backing layer, impermeable and protective. Beneath that lay the reservoir, a gel-filled pocket containing the fentanyl suspended in alcohol. Below the reservoir sat the rate-controlling membrane, a high-tech sieve with pores of a precise microscopic diameter. Finally, there was the adhesive, the glue that would bind the device to the warmth of the human body. When placed upon the chest or the upper arm, a silent biological conversation began. The concentration of the drug in the patch was high. The concentration in the body was zero. The molative, driven by the second law of thermodynamics, the molecules sought equilibrium. They migrated from the high concentration of the gel through the regulating membrane and into the skin. Picture the journey of the molecule now. It is a slow, steady migration. It moves through the adhesive, sinks into the dead layers of the epidermis, and swims down into the dermis, where the capillary beds wait like a net of red lace. There it is swept up by the blood and carried to the brain. This was the invention of the steady state. Unlike the pill, which creates a jagged mountain range of drug levels in the blood, high, then low, then high again, the patch created a flat, calm horizon. It provided 72 hours of continuous, uninterrupted silence. For the cancer patient in 1995, this was a miracle that bordered on the divine. Imagine an elderly woman, her bones riddled with metastasis, who had spent the last months of her life watching the clock, terrified of the moment when her pain medication would wear off. The pain was a wolf scratching at the door, and she lived in constant fear of its entry. Then comes the patch. She applies it on a Monday morning. The wolf stops scratching. The pain recedes into the background, becoming a distant, muffled noise rather than a scream. She does not need to swallow pills that make her nauseous. She does not need to wake up at 3 a.m. to take another dose. She sleeps. She knits. She holds her grandchild. The patch is invisible, hidden under her blouse, a secret guardian that whispers to her nerves, "Peace, be still." This was the democratization of the molecule. Fentanyl was no longer the exclusive property of the anesthesiologist in the mask. It was now in the hands of the grandmother, the veteran, the construction worker with the broken back. It went home with them. It rode in the passenger seat of their cars. It sat on the nightstand next to the reading glasses and the glass of water. This shift in geography, from the hospital to the home, was a profound cultural moment. It marked the domestication of the dragon. We invited the most potent opioid in history into our living rooms, treating it with the casual familiarity of a Band-Aid. We trusted the technology. We trusted the membrane. We believed that because it looked like a sticker, it was safe. But the patch was not the only form the changeling took. As the 90s progressed, the pharmaceutical industry sought to solve another problem: breakthrough pain. Even with the steady river of the patch, some patients experienced sudden, jagged spikes of agoniments where the pain broke through the dam. They needed a rescue. They needed something faster than a pill, something that worked as instantly as an injection, but without the needle. Enter the lozenge. Enter the medicinal lollipop. Marketed under the name Actique, this was perhaps the most surreal and symbolic of all the fentanyl formulations. It was a white, berry-flavored lozenge on a plastic stick. It looked, for all intents and purposes, like a piece of candy. It was designed to be rubbed against the inside of the cheek, the buccal mucosa. The mouth is a highly absorbent landscape. The skin inside the cheek is thin and rich with blood vessels. When the fentanyl lozenge dissolves, the drug passes instantly through the mucosa and enters the bloodstream, bypassing the stomach and the liver. It hits the brain in minutes. It is a flash flood of relief. There is a jarring, almost gothic duality in the image of the fentanyl lollipop. Here we have the ultimate symbol of childhood innocence, the candy on a stick, fused with the ultimate symbol of adult lethality. The berry flavor was added to mask the bitter, alkaline taste of the chemical, a spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. For the terminal patient, this was a final mercy. It gave them control. If the pain flared, they could reach for the stick, and within moments, the world would soften. It allowed them to attend weddings, to sit through dinners, to participate in the final acts of their lives without being paralyzed by suffering. But in this accessibility lay the seeds of a darker harvest. By normalizing the presence of such potent chemistry in the domestic sphere, the reverence for its lethality began to fade. The ritual of the count, that sacred ceremony of the hospital where nurses tallied every microgram, did not exist in the bathroom of a suburban home. There were no double-locked steel doors. There were no armed guards. There was only a mirrored cabinet, often unlocked, accessible to anyone who walked into the room. The ghost had been invited into the house, and it was disguised as a mundane medical supply. Consider the optics. A vial of liquid morphine looks dangerous. It looks medical. A syringe looks frightening. It speaks of puncture and blood. But a patch? A patch looks like a nicotine aid. It looks like a piece of tape. A lollipop looks like a treat. The visual language of danger had been stripped away. The wolf was not only in the house, it was wearing sheep's clothing. This camouflage led to tragic accidents. A child, seeing a sticker that had fallen off a grandparent's arm, might pick it up and play with it, or put it in their mouth. A toddler, finding a berry-flavored lozenge on a nightstand, might consume a dose meant for a 200-pound man with a tolerance built over years. The margin for error with fentanyl is razor thin, and in the chaotic environment of a family home, errors are inevitable. But the greater danger was not accidental. It was the inevitable curiosity of the human shadow. The patch was a marvel of engineering, yes, but it was also a Trojan horse. Inside that innocent square of plastic sat a reservoir of pure fentanyl gel. The patch was designed to release this gel slowly, over 72 hours. But the total amount of drug contained within the reservoir was massive enough to kill a person several times over if released all at once. It did not take long for the psychonauts of the underground and the desperate addicts of the opioid crisis to figure this out. They realized that the time-release mechanism was merely mechanical. It could be bypassed. If one were to cut the patch open, the gel could be extracted. It could be eaten. It could be smoked. It could be injected. By destroying the vessel, one could access the raw power of the god within. The steady river of relief could be turned into a tidal wave of euphoria and death. This was the fatal flaw of the reservoir design. It carried a payload of nuclear proportions in a container made of plastic foil. It relied on the user to follow the rules. It relied on the user to want relief, not oblivion. But the molecule acts on the reward centers of the brain. It creates a hunger for itself. To hand a reservoir of pure fentanyl to a person with an addiction disorder is like handing a starving man a locked box of food and telling him to only eat a crumb a day. Eventually, he will smash the box. The normalization of the patch also changed the culture of prescribing. In the 1990s, a movement swept through American medicine. The movement to treat pain as the fifth vital sign. Doctors were told that pain was undertreated, that they were being cruel by withholding opioids. The definition of pain expanded. It moved from the cancer ward to the orthopedist's office, then to the general practitioner's clinic. Suddenly, the patch was not just for the dying, it was for the back injury. It was for the severe migraine. It was for the fibromyalgia patient. The sales representatives of the pharmaceutical giants, carrying their catered lunches and their glossy charts, pushed the narrative that these long-acting opioids were safe, that they were less addictive because they didn't cause a euphoric rush. This was a seduction of the medical intellect. It was a belief that the delivery system could sanitize the drug. We thought that if we wrapped the wolf in a slow-release membrane, it would become a dog. We were wrong. The brain does not care about the delivery system, it cares about the receptor occupancy. And fentanyl, slowly saturating the brain day after day, creates a tolerance and a dependence that is profound and difficult to break. The white dress of the hospital had been replaced by the flannel and denim of the everyday. The drug was now a roommate. It sat in the medicine cabinet next to the toothpaste and the shaving cream. It sat next to the aspirin and the vitamins. This proximity breeds contemptor, rather, a lack of appropriate fear. When a substance becomes furniture, we stop seeing it. We stop respecting it. Imagine the bathroom of a typical middle-class home in 1998. The morning light streams in through the frosted window. On the shelf, there is a clutter of life. A hairbrush, a bottle of cologne, a half-empty tube of ointment. And there, in a cardboard box, sit 10 patches of fentanyl. Each one contains enough power to stop the breathing of everyone in the house. But they sit there, silent and unassuming, waiting for the grandmother's bad back, or waiting for the teenager who has heard a rumor at school about how to chew the patch. The democratization of the molecule was a triumph of access, but a failure of containment. We had spread the net too wide. We had assumed that the discipline of the operating theater could be exported to the living room. We had assumed that the patient would always be a patient and never a seeker of oblivion. The lozenge, too, found its way into the dark mythology of the street. Percopops, they were sometimes called, though they were far stronger than Percocet. The image of the lollipop stick protruding from the mouth of a user became a symbol of the infantilization of addiction, the mixing of the nursery and the morgue. And there was another hidden danger in the patch, the issue of disposal. When a patient removes a patch after 3 days, it is not empty. The mechanism relies on concentration gradients, meaning that for the drug to flow into the skin, there must always be more in the patch than in the body. A used patch still contains 30 to 50% of its original load. These used patches were thrown in the trash. They were flushed down toilets. They ended up in landfills. They ended up in the mouths of dogs. They ended up in the hands of those who would boil them down to extract the remaining ghost. The gray death was leaching into the ecosystem, quite literally. As the millennium turned, the era of the white dress was definitively over. The genie was not only out of the bottle, it was mass-produced, packaged in foil, and available at the corner pharmacy. The silence of the synthetic had become a hum, a background radiation of potential overdose that permeated the suburbs and the rural towns. We must look at this period with a deep sense of tragic irony. The intentions were compassionate. The scientists who developed the transdermal system were trying to give freedom to the bound. They were trying to allow a grandfather to walk his daughter down the aisle without grimacing in pain. They were trying to let the terminally ill sleep through the night, and they succeeded. They brought immeasurable relief to millions. But in doing so, they paved a highway for the molecule to travel into the heart of society. They removed the gatekeepers. They made the invisible visible. And then, they made it mundane. The patch and the lollipop represent the peak of pharmaceutical hubris, the belief that we could engineer a safe interface between a prehistoric brain and a hyper-potent synthetic chemical. We designed the perfect delivery system, but we forgot to design a system to protect us from ourselves. The sun sets on the 1990s. The medicine cabinet door closes with a soft click. Inside, the ghost waits. It is no longer a stranger, it is a member of the family. And like all family secrets, it is waiting for the moment to emerge and tear the house apart. The silence is no longer the peace of the cured, it is the held breath of the victim. The landscape of pain has been altered forever. The poppy field is a distant memory. The factory has taken over. And in the quiet hum of the domestic sphere, the synthetic silence is preparing to scream. The anatomy of the sticker. To fully grasp the insidious nature of this phase, we must look closer at the physical object, the patch itself. It was a triumph of materials science. The adhesive was a polyisobutylene blend, designed to stick to skin that sweats, moves, and stretches. It had to be tenacious. It had to bond with the epidermis so intimately that it became a second skin. This intimacy is symbolic. The drug was no longer an external force applied by a doctor. It was an augmentation of the self. The patient wearing the patch became the vessel. They carried the reservoir of silence on their own body, hidden beneath their clothes. It was a secret they walked with. This invisibility contributed to the psychological shift. When you take a pill, you perform an action. You are reminded, I am taking a drug. When you receive an injection, the prick of the needle is a reminder, I am being medicated. But the patch? You put it on, and you forget it. It becomes part of you. The drug enters you passively, constantly, bypassing the conscious mind. This creates a different kind of dependence. The user does not associate the relief with a specific moment of consumption, but rather with a state of being. They simply feel normal while the patch is on, and wrong when it is off. The drug becomes the baseline of existence. The silence becomes the atmosphere they breathe. The Trojan horse of gel. The reservoir design of the early patches was the specific technological flaw that fueled the early fires of the epidemic. The liquid gel inside was essentially pure fentanyl concentrate. In the hands of a legitimate patient, the membrane stood guard. But the membrane was fragile. It became a piece of grim folklore among the addicted. How to cook a patch. How to cheek a patch. Internet forums in the early days of the web began to fill with instructions. The knowledge of how to weaponize the medical device spread faster than the warnings. Users found that by cutting the patch and squeezing the gel onto a piece of foil, they could smoke it. This turned a 72-hour slow-release medication into a 10-second hit of overwhelming intensity. It was an alchemical transformation, turning a tool of chronic stability into a tool of acute oblivion. The pharmaceutical companies eventually realized this vulnerability. Years later, they would switch to a matrix design, where the drug was embedded directly into the plastic adhesive, making it much harder to extract. But for a decade, the reservoir patches were the gold standard and the golden ticket for the underworld. The sweet taste of oblivion. The Actique Lollipop deserves its own specific meditation. It was a product that seemed to defy the seriousness of its contents. It came in a gray plastic holder with a child-resistant lock that was notoriously difficult for arthritic fingers to open, yet the product itself was so inviting. The marketing of Actique was aggressive. It was pushed not just for cancer pain, but for migraines, for back pain flare-ups. The off-label prescribing began to soar. Doctors, reassured by the friendly form factor, prescribed it for conditions that did not warrant such nuclear-grade weaponry. Imagine a construction worker with a slipped disc. He is given a box of lollipops. He puts one in his mouth after a long shift. The berry taste floods his tongue. The fentanyl floods his brain. The pain vanishes, replaced by a warm, fuzzy blanket of well-being. He is not a cancer patient. He has a life to live. But the molecule does not distinguish. It binds, it rewires, and soon the lollipop is not a treat. It is a necessity. The breakthrough pain concept was valid for the dying, but when applied to the living, it became a trap. Life is breakthrough pain. To attempt to smooth out every jagged edge of existence with fentanyl is to court death. The erosion of boundaries. The movement of fentanyl into the home also eroded the boundary between the sick and the well. In the hospital, the roles are clear, but at home, the lines blur. Teenagers raid medicine cabinets. It is a rite of passage in the suburbs. In the past, they might find Valium or leftover codeine. Dangerous, yes, but rarely instantly fatal. Now, they found fentanyl. A teenager does not know that a 100 microgram patch is meant for a person with opioid tolerance. They do not know that chewing it releases the full load. They see a sticker, they see a challenge, they see a high. This is the tragedy of the dark harvest. The innocent curiosity of youth colliding with the unforgiving mathematics of the synthetic opioid. One mistake, one stolen patch, and the silence descends forever. The home, once the safest place on earth, becomes a minefield. The historical echo. We can hear the echo of the 19th century here. Just as laudanum, opium, and alcohol sat on the shelf of every Victorian household, used for everything from toothaches to hysteria, fentanyl had become the modern laudanum. But the difference in potency is logarithmic. Laudanum was a candlelight, fentanyl is a laser beam. The Victorians learned the hard way that having opium in the cupboard led to opium eaters and accidental overdoses. We, in our high-tech hubris, thought we were different. We thought our membranes and our polymers would protect us. We forgot that the hunger for relief is a universal human constant, and that the substance always finds a way out of the vessel. The twilight of the prescription era. As we stand at the end of this chapter, we must recognize that this was the peak of the legal fentanyl era. The vast majority of the drug was still being made in inspected factories by people in white coats, sold in pharmacies with bells on the doors. But the demand was being built. The brain chemistry of a nation was being altered, one patch at a time. The receptors were being primed. A hunger was being created that the legal system would eventually try to cut off. And when the doctors finally stopped writing the prescriptions, when the pill mills were shut down and the patches became harder to get, the hunger remained. The market abhors a vacuum. The table was set for the cartels. The table was set for the illicit laboratories of China and Mexico. The ghost had learned the layout of the American home. It knew the address, and soon it would return, not in a patch or a lollipop, but in a counterfeit pill, pressed in a garage, carrying the same silence, but with none of the quality control. The democratization was complete. The tragedy was just beginning. The river of relief was about to flood its banks and drown the valley. The patch peeled away, leaving the raw wound exposed to the air. The lollipop stick lay in the gutter, stripped of its sugar, leaving only the bitter taste of loss. There is a law of the universe that applies to water, to light, and to truth. Containment is temporary. Build a dam, and the water will eventually find a fissure. Build a wall, and the light will find a crack. Lock a secret in a vault of steel and ethics, and the secret will eventually turn into a whisper, slipping through the keyhole to dance on the wind. The knowledge of how to synthesize the synthetic silence could not be held within the brick walls of Beerse forever. Dr. Janssen's formula was a masterpiece of intellect, published in patents, recorded in journals, and stored in the great libraries of the world. For a time it sat there quietly, read only by the devout monks of the chemical fraternity, men and women sworn to the Hippocratic oath, who saw the molecule as a sacred vessel of mercy. But chemistry is a language, and languages can be learned by anyone with the patience to decode the syntax. In the late 1970s, as the psychedelic idealism of the 60s curdled into the harder, grittier reality of the disco era, a shadow fell over the chemistry. The book of the molecule was opened by hands that did not tremble with reverence, but with greed. We must shift our gaze now. We leave the rain-swept plains of Belgium and the sterile, bright corridors of the university hospital. We travel west to the sun-bleached sprawl of California, to the suburban garages and the nondescript warehouses of the American dream. It is 1979. The air smells of gasoline and jasmine. The radio plays the synthesizer-heavy beats of a changing world. And in the quiet corners of Orange County, a new kind of alchemist is putting on an apron. This is the birth of the rogue chemist. Unlike the cartels of the future, who would industrialize death with the efficiency of a corporation, these early pioneers were often solitary figures. They were the mad scientists of the underworld. Some were dropouts from PhD programs, men with brilliant minds but fractured souls who saw in the periodic table not a way to understand the universe, but a way to hack it. They read the papers of Paul Janssen not as medical texts, but as treasure maps. They realized a profound and terrifying truth. The poppy was obsolete. For 5,000 years, the opium trade had been bound to the earth. To make heroin, you needed land, thousands of acres of it. You needed farmers to score the pods. You needed soldiers to guard the fields. You needed sunshine and rain. You needed to smuggle bulky, smelly opium gum across borders, hiding it in the hulls of ships and the bellies of mules. It was a logistical nightmare, vulnerable to drought, to blight, and to the DEA. But fentanyl required no land. It required no sun. It required only a room, a ventilation fan, and a set of glassware. It required precursors, chemicals that, individually, were innocent solvents and reagents used in the paint and plastic industries. These shadow alchemists realized that they could condense an entire poppy field into a 5-liter flask. They could replace the seasons with a chemical reaction that took a few hours. They could create a product so potent that a shoebox could supply a city. This realization was the spark that lit the fuse of the modern crisis. It was the moment the drug trade moved from the agricultural age to the information age. The China White Mystery. The first sign of the shadow appeared in the bodies. In late 1979, in the counties surrounding Los Angeles, junkies began to die. This, in itself, was not new. The life of the addict is always a dance with mortality. But these deaths were different. They were sudden. They were absolute. The needle was often still in the arm. The bodies were found in poses of peaceful, instant repose, as if a switch had been flipped. The police and the coroners were baffled. They suspected a hotshot, a batch of heroin that was too pure. They tested the blood of the victims. They looked for morphine, the metabolite of heroin. They found nothing. The blood was clean. There were no opiates present. It was a ghostly mystery. The victims had all the signs of an opioid overdose: pinpoint pupils, fluid in the lungs, the blue tint of cyanosis, but the chemistry was invisible. On the streets, a whisper began to circulate. They called it China White. It was sold as a legendary, super pure heroin from the Orient. It was white powder, fine as talc, smooth and clean. The users sought it out with a fatal curiosity. It offered a high that was described as a clean drift, a silence deeper than anything the black tar of Mexico could provide. But it was not heroin. It was not from China. It was from a garage in California. The rogue chemists had synthesized an analog of fentanyl, alpha-methylfentanyl. Here we must pause to appreciate the darker side of chemical creativity. The patent laws protect specific molecular structures. If Dr. Janssen patented fentanyl, he owned that specific arrangement of atoms. But if you added a single carbon atom-methyl group to the chain, you created a new molecule. It was technically not fentanyl. It was a cousin, a ghost sibling. This was the genius of the shadow. By tweaking the formula, by changing a single atom here or there, the chemists did two things. First, they evaded the law. In 1979, alpha-methylfentanyl was not a scheduled substance. It was legal to possess, legal to make, because it didn't exist in the eyes of the DEA. It was a designer drug, a term that would come to define the era. Second, they altered the potency. Some of these analogs were weaker than the original. Some were wildly, terrifyingly stronger. Alpha-methylfentanyl was potent, long-lasting, and elusive. Because standard toxicology screens were looking for the shape of the morphine molecule, this new shape slipped right through the test. It was the ghost in the machine of forensic science. For months, the China White phenomenon terrorized and captivated the West Coast. It was a phantom plague. The police were chasing a drug they couldn't name, catching dealers selling a powder that wasn't illegal, and finding bodies that had no cause of death. It took the forensic brilliance of dedicated toxicologists, working late into the night, to finally identify the specter. They had to look for the fingerprint of the synthetic process, the tiny impurities left behind by the reaction in the garage. When they finally found it, when they realized that the heroin was actually a variant of the most powerful hospital anesthetic known to man, a chill went through the law enforcement community. They realized the rules of the game had changed forever. The Alchemist's apron. Let us imagine the scene in one of these clandestine laboratories. It is distinct from the sterile beauty of Beerse. There are no white tiles, no stainless steel autoclaves. The walls are unfinished drywall or grease-stained concrete. The light comes from a single buzzing fluorescent tube. The air is thick with the smell of chemicals, acetone, benzyl chloride, the sweet, rotting scent of precursors. The cook wears a rubber apron and a gas mask that transforms his face into that of an insect. He stands over a round-bottomed flask that sits in a heating mantle. Inside, a dark liquid boils and churns. This is a ritual of transmutation. He is mixing specific ingredients: N-phenethyl 4-piperidone, NPP, and aniline, following a recipe that is as much art as it is science. He watches the temperature gauge. If it gets too hot, the batch is ruined. If it's too cold, the reaction stalls. He is not thinking of the patient on the operating table. He is not thinking of the white dress of medicine. He is thinking of the yield. He is thinking of the kilos. He knows that a single kilogram of this powder, once cut and diluted, will fetch millions of dollars on the street. The purity of Dr. Janssen's intent has been muddied. The molecule is no longer a tool of mercy. It is a commodity. It is being stripped of its medical context, stripped of its dosage guidelines, and stripped of its safety margins. In the hospital, fentanyl is diluted to micrograms. In the garage, it is scooped up in spoons. The cut, the mixing of the pure drug with lactose or mannitols, done not by a precision machine, but by a man with a blender. This is the chocolate chip cookie effect. In a batch of cookies, some might have 5 chocolate chips, some might have none. In a batch of street fentanyl, one pill might be a dud, and the next might contain a lethal dose. The production moved from the sterilization of the clinic to the chaotic, unregulated world of the black market. The molecule, once a precise scalpel used by a surgeon to save a life, was becoming a blunt instrument, a sledgehammer swinging in the dark. The cat and mouse of structure. The 1980s became a high-stakes game of molecular cat and mouse. The government would identify a new analog, say, 3-methylfentanyl, a monster thousands of times stronger than morphine, and they would pass a law to ban it. The ink would barely be dry on the legislation before the chemists in the basements would shift their strategy. They banned the methyl group on the 3rd carbon? Fine. We will move it to the 4th carbon. Or we will add a fluorine atom to the aniline ring. It was a dizzying display of organic chemistry used as a weapon of evasion. The Federal Analog Act was eventually passed in the United States to try to close this loophole, making any substance substantially similar to a controlled drug illegal. But the definition of similar is a legal gray area, and the chemistry moved faster than the courts. This era of the shadow alchemists proved that prohibition is a leaky vessel when the prohibited item can be reinvented endlessly. You can burn a poppy field, but you cannot burn an idea. You cannot arrest a chemical reaction. The toxic fog. As the years passed, the knowledge continued to spread. It moved from the brilliant, solitary chemists to the organized syndicates. The cartels of Mexico, watching the profits of the China White era, took note. They saw the economics. They saw the future. Why rely on the weather in the Golden Triangle? Why deal with warlords in Afghanistan? Why wait for the harvest? They began to import the precursors. They began to build their own super labs, not in garages but in industrial compounds. They industrialized the shadow. The molecule began to drift into the streets like a toxic fog. It wasn't just China White anymore. It was everywhere. It was in the heroin supply of the East Coast. It was in the fake pharmaceutical pills flooding the Midwest. It was a silent, invisible additive that turned every drug purchase into a potential death sentence. The fog is a perfect metaphor. You cannot fight fog with a sword. You cannot shoot it. It seeps into everything. It obscures the landscape. It chills the bone. The tragedy of this chapter in the molecule's history is the loss of control. Dr. Janssen had bottled the genie to serve humanity. The rogue chemists smashed the bottle to serve themselves. And in doing so, they unleashed a force that no one, not the doctors, not the police, not the users, could fully comprehend. The molecule had been liberated. It was free. And like a wild animal raised in captivity and then released into a city, it did not know how to coexist. It only knew how to do what it was designed to do: to bind, to silence, to close the eyes of the world. The synthetic silence was no longer a gift of sleep. It was the theft of breath. The shadow in the laboratory had grown long, stretching out of the basement window, across the lawn, and into the bedrooms of a sleeping nation. The sun was setting on the era of the organic high, and the long, cold night of the synthetic was beginning in earnest. We stand now at the threshold of the modern crisis. The chemistry is established. The supply lines are open. The market is hungry. The stage is set for the final, devastating act of the drama, where the molecule ceases to be a drug and becomes a force of nature, a hurricane of white powder sweeping across the map. But let us not forget the image of that first rogue chemist, in the flickering light of 1979, watching the flask boil. He is the Prometheus of the underworld. He has stolen the fire of the gods, but he has no idea how to control the burn. And the fire is catching. The world is made of paper, and the fire is catching. The legacy of the analogs. We must also pause to consider the scientific legacy of this dark period. In their quest to evade the law, these shadow chemists inadvertently explored the map of the opioid receptor more thoroughly than legitimate science had time to do. They discovered variants like carfentanil, originally synthesized by Janssen for large game animals, and brought them into the realm of human consumption theories. Carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent than morphine. It is used to sedate elephants. It is a substance so powerful that a few grains, the size of a virus almost, can kill a human. The fact that this elephant tranquilizer would eventually be found in heroin sold on the streets of Ohio is the ultimate grim punchline to the story of the Shadow Laboratory. It represents the total decoupling of the drug from the human scale. We are no longer dealing with substances meant for men. We are dealing with substances meant for giants, for monsters, or for nothing at all. The shadow chemists pushed the potency curve to the vertical. They created a chemistry of excess that the human biology simply cannot withstand. The economic imperative. Underlying this entire shift is the cold, hard heartbeat of economics. The shadow in the laboratory is also a shadow on the ledger. The profit margin of fentanyl compared to heroin is astronomical. A kilogram of heroin might cost a cartel $6,000 to produce and sell for $60,000. A kilogram of fentanyl might cost $200 to produce and sell for $1.5 million when cut into doses. This economic gravity is irresistible. It is the black hole that pulls the entire drug trade towards the synthetic. The rogue chemist of the 70s proved the business model. He showed that you could bypass the farmer, the weather, and the border patrol. He showed that the future was chemical. And so, the shadow grew. It swallowed the poppy fields. It swallowed the street corners. It swallowed the concept of a recreational drug user. In the shadow of the laboratory, there is no recreation. There is only the binary choice, the high or the void. The silence of the synthetic is absolute, and it was born not in the mountains of Afghanistan, but in the suburbs of the West, amidst the lawnmowers and the tool benches, where a man with a book and a beaker decided to rewrite the definition of oblivion. To understand the flood, we must first understand the rain. But this rain does not fall from the clouds. It flows from the cold, unyielding logic of numbers. We leave behind the romantic imagery of the opium den and the tragic nobility of the hospital ward. We enter now the realm of pure, ruthless economics, a world governed by the mathematics of infinity. For centuries, the illicit narcotics trade was bound by the laws of agriculture. The poppy, Papaver somniferum, is a demanding mistress. She requires land vast, rolling hectares of it. She requires water, specific soil pH, and the benevolent gaze of the sun. She is vulnerable to the blight of fungus, the ravages of drought, and the torches of the eradication squads. To produce a ton of heroin, one must cultivate a landscape. One must manage a workforce of farmers, harvesters, and guards. The supply chain is heavy, slow, and anchored to the physical earth. But the synthetic molecule has no such master. It is liberated from the soil. It is born of the reactor and the flask. The supply of fentanyl is theoretically endless. It is limited not by the seasons or the harvest, but only by the availability of precursor chemicals, substances like NPP and 4-ANPP, which are produced in industrial quantities for legitimate uses in plastics and pesticides. As long as the chemical industry exists, the potential for fentanyl exists. It is a crop that can be harvested every hour, every day, in any weather, in any basement or warehouse on the planet. This is the first variable in the equation of infinity, unlimited production. The second variable is density. Let us visualize the physical reality of smuggling. Imagine a drug trafficker in the 1980s attempting to move product across a border. If he wishes to smuggle 1 million doses of heroin, he needs a truck. He needs hidden compartments, false floors, welded gas tanks. The sheer bulk of the plant-based drug is its own liability. It takes up space. It has a smell. It is a physical object that must be managed. Now imagine the modern trafficker with fentanyl. Because the molecule is 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin, the physics of the trade collapse. A dose of heroin is measured in milligrams. A dose of fentanyl is measured in micrograms. To smuggle 1 million doses of fentanyl, one does not need a truck. One needs a shoebox. A single kilogram of pure fentanyl packaged the size of a large book, easily wrapped in birthday paper or hidden in a spare tire, contains potentially 1 million lethal doses. This is the logistical miracle that transformed the underworld. It turned the problem of smuggling into a triviality. The drug could be mailed in a standard envelope. It could be hidden in the lining of a suitcase. It could be carried in a pocket. This compression of power changed the gravitational pull of the black market. The risk-to-reward ratio shifted violently. A mule carrying a backpack of heroin might risk 20 years in prison for a profit of $10,000. A mule carrying a backpack of fentanyl risks the same prison time, but the profit potential is in the millions. The mathematics are irresistible. The iron law of prohibition suggests that as enforcement increases, drugs tend to become more potent and more compact because they are easier to hide. Fentanyl is the ultimate expression of this law. It is the singularity of smuggling, a black hole of potency that is invisible to the naked eye. The ghostly additive. This logistical miracle for the trafficker became a nightmare for the world. If fentanyl had remained a distinct product, sold openly as fentanyl to those who sought it, the tragedy might have been contained. But the economics dictated a more insidious strategy. Because it is so cheap to produce and so powerful, fentanyl became the universal mixer. It became the ghostly additive, the unseen extender of profits. Dealers and cartels realized they could take a kilogram of weak, low-quality heroin and boost it with a dusting of fentanyl. Suddenly, the weak heroin hits like the best product on the street. The users, seeking the fire, flock to the dealer. The profit margin soars. The dealer is selling mostly filler, spiked with a microscopic amount of the synthetic. But mixing a microgram potent drug into a powder is not like mixing sugar into coffee. It requires pharmaceutical-grade precision a V-blender that tumbles the mixture for hours to ensure even distribution. In the clandestine labs of the cartels, such precision is rare. Instead, the mixing is often done in blenders, in buckets, with shovels. This creates the chocolate chip cookie effect. Imagine a batch of cookie dough where the chocolate chips are fatal poison. If you don't mix the dough perfectly, one cookie might have no chips, and the next cookie might be solid chocolate. In the world of fentanyl, this uneven mixing is a death sentence. A user might buy a bag of heroin on Tuesday and be fine. On Wednesday, they buy a bag from the same dealer, the same batch, but this bag contains a hotspot, a clump of pure fentanyl the size of a grain of salt. They inject it, and the silence descends instantly. But the ghost did not stop at heroin. It began to migrate into other substances where opioids had no business being. It was found in cocaine, a stimulant. It was found in methamphetamine. Why? Partly cross-contamination in the packing houses, where the same tables are used for all drugs. But partly a dark marketing strategy to hook customers on a more physically addictive substance. The most terrifying evolution, however, was the counterfeit pill. The cartels, observing the American obsession with prescription painkillers, the legacy of the white dress era, realized that many users were afraid of needles. They wanted pills. They wanted the blue OxyContin, the white Xanax, the yellow Percocet. They trusted the pharmaceutical shape. They trusted the markings. So, the underworld bought pill presses, industrial machines capable of punching out thousands of tablets an hour. They took fentanyl powder, mixed it with blue dye and filler, and pressed it into pills that looked identical to the pharmacy product. They stamped them with the M30 logo of legitimate oxycodone. This was the ultimate camouflage. The molecule was now hiding in plain sight, disguised as a medicine. A college student, stressed about exams, buys a Xanax from a friend to help him sleep. He thinks he is taking a safe, regulated anxiety medication. He swallows the pill, but there is no alprazolam in it. It is pressed fentanyl. He never wakes up. A construction worker with a bad back buys Oxy from a guy at the bar because his prescription ran out. He thinks he knows his tolerance. He takes 2. He stops breathing in his truck. This is the Russian roulette of the modern street. The user no longer knows what they are buying. The transaction has lost all transparency. They are purchasing a familiar experience, a blue pill, a white powder, but receiving a chemical anomaly. The feedback loop of dose and effect is broken. The invisible passenger. Fentanyl became the invisible passenger in the global narcotics supply. It travels silently. It has no smell, no taste, no distinct color. You cannot look at a line of cocaine and see the fentanyl. You cannot look at a pill and see the death hidden inside. This invisibility creates a psychological terror that permeates the drug culture. In the past, overdose was a risk, but it was often linked to excess, taking too much. Now, overdose is random. It is linked to contamination. A first-time user can die just as easily as a hardened addict. The safety of the experimental phase is gone. The silence of the drug was no longer a medical mercy, the white dress of the hospital.
It was just before 7:30 in the evening. The setting sun cast long, bloody shadows across the field. Napoleon rode out to a position near La Haie Sainte to personally oversee his final gambit. He gathered the last available battalions of his middle guard, men who had been held in reserve all day, watching the carnage with the disciplined patience of elite soldiers. There were perhaps no more than 4,000 of them, a pitifully small number for a battle of this scale, but they were not just any soldiers. They were the Guard. Their tall bearskin hats, their immaculate uniforms, their grim, weathered faces, all projected an aura of invincibility. In over a decade of warfare, the Guard had never been known to fail in an attack.
But in this drive for efficiency, the human factor is discarded. The user is no longer a customer to be cultivated. They are a variable in a high-turnover equation. If a batch kills a few people, it paradoxically acts as advertising. That stuff is strong, the word goes out, and the desperate, those whose tolerance is a towering wall, flock to the danger, seeking the only thing that can touch their pain. The infinite horizon. As we gaze out over this landscape of infinite supply, we see the true scale of the challenge. You cannot bomb a field that doesn't exist. You cannot burn a crop that is made of common chemicals. You are fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, shut down one lab, and two more open in a warehouse down the street. The molecule has become a phantom. It is everywhere and nowhere. It is in the water table of our culture. And as the sun sets on the era of the poppy, we are left in the cold, blue light of the synthetic age, counting the numbers, doing the math, and realizing that the equation does not balance in favor of life. The silence is spreading, the numbers are rising, and the mathematics of infinity march on, indifferent to the souls they subtract from the world. To understand the final act of the molecule, we must first understand the miracle that it undoes. We must turn our gaze inward, past the conscious mind, past the memories and the personality, down into the deepest, darkest foundations of the human structure. We must descend into the brainstem. This is the ancient cellar of our biology, the reptilian core that has hummed with a steady electric rhythm since our ancestors first crawled from the primordial oceans onto the mud of a waiting earth. It is here, in the medulla oblongata, that the most sacred ritual of life is performed, the act of breathing. Breath is the metronome of existence. From the moment of birth, when the lungs first unfurl and taste the cold air of the world, to the final rattle of the dying, the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation defines us. It is the invisible thread that binds the spirit to the clay. The Latins called it spiritus breath, spirit, courage. To breathe is to be. And for millions of years, this mechanism has been guarded by the most robust, redundant, and fierce biological alarms in the animal kingdom. The body will fight for air above all else. Hunger can be ignored, thirst can be withstood for days, pain can be endured. But steal the breath for even a minute, and the body will erupt in a volcanic panic of survival. It is the air hunger, the terrified thrashing of the drowning man, the primal scream of the suffocating. But the tragedy of fentanyl, and the source of its terrifying perfection, is that it bypasses this alarm. It does not storm the castle of life with violence, it picks the lock. It enters the throne room of the breath and whispers a lie so seductive that the body simply forgets to live. What happens when the molecule takes hold in the dark? We must look at the physiology of the end with a somber, detached gaze. We must strip away the moral judgments of addiction and the sociological weight of the crisis, and look simply at the chemistry of the silence. The journey begins in the blood. The molecule, having crossed the blood-brain barrier with its ghostly ease, finds its way to the brainstem. Here lies a cluster of neurons known as the pre-Botzinger complex. This is the pacemaker of respiration. It is a tiny, localized knot of tissue that dictates the rhythm of the diaphragm. It says, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It does this when we sleep, when we run, when we weep, and when we dream. It is the autopilot of the soul. These neurons are studded with mu-opioid receptors. In the natural order of things, these receptors are there to receive endorphins, to modulate the breathing slightly during moments of stress or pain. But fentanyl is not a modulator. It is a silencer. It binds to these receptors with a gravitational force that freezes the machinery. It inhibits the electrical firing of the pacemaker. The command to breathe begins to stutter. The respiratory rate, normally a steady 12 to 20 breaths per minute, begins to slow. It drops to 10, then 8, then 4. In a normal scenario, the slowing of breath triggers a chemical crisis. As breathing slows, carbon dioxide builds up in the blood. CO2 is an acid. As the blood becomes acidic, sensors in the brainstem taste this change and sound the alarm. They scream to the diaphragm, "Pump harder, ventilate, clear the poison." This is why you cannot hold your breath until you die. The will to breathe will override your conscious mind, forcing you to gasp. But fentanyl is a master of deception. It blunts the sensitivity of these chemoreceptors. It places a hood over the sensors. The carbon dioxide rises. The blood turns acidic. The dark tide of waste gas floods the system, and the brain does not care. The alarm bells are ringing, but the operator has been sedated. The panic response, the terror of suffocation, is chemically deleted. This is the profound horror of the opioid overdose, the absence of struggle. The victim does not feel like they are choking. They do not feel the tightening of the noose. Instead, they feel a heavy, warm, encompassing comfort. The nod of the high deepens into a twilight state where the boundary between sleep and death becomes porous. To the sleeper, the sensation is not one of ending, but of expanding. The pain of the world, the physical pain of the back, the emotional pain of the trauma, the existential pain of poverty or loneliness, dissolves into a white, fuzzy static. The body feels heavy, as if sinking into a soft mattress of lead. The eyelids are too heavy to lift. The thoughts become slow, viscous, dreamlike. There is a specific phenomenon that occurs with fentanyl, a grim physiological signature known as the wooden chest. In some cases, particularly with rapid high-dose injection, the drug causes a sudden, rigid paralysis of the muscles in the chest wall and the diaphragm. The torso freezes. The bellows of the lungs are locked in place. Even if the brain wanted to take a breath, the mechanics of the body would refuse. The term wooden chest evokes the coffin before the death. The body becomes its own cage. This rigidity is a side effect of the drug's interaction with the motor neurons, a seizure-like stiffness that makes ventilation impossible. For the anesthesiologist in the operating room, this is a known risk, countered with muscle relaxants and intubation. But for the user in a parked car or a bedroom, there is no countermeasure. There is only the sudden, stone-like immobility of the rib cage. Yet, even this is often painless. The consciousness is fading too fast to register the trap. The oxygen levels in the blood begin to plummet. Hypoxia sets in. We must visualize the color of this transition. Oxygen is the fire of life. It turns the blood a bright, vibrant crimson. As the oxygen fades, the fire dims. The blood turns dark, a deep, bruising purple. This change manifests in the skin. The lips turn blue, a hue known as cyanosis. The fingertips turn gray. The face takes on a pallor that is distinct from the paleness of fear. It is the paleness of absence. The heart, that faithful servant, continues to beat for a while. It is a resilient muscle, possessing its own electrical system. It pumps the darkening blood through the stopping veins. But the heart needs oxygen to fuel its rhythm. As the lungs fall silent, the heart begins to starve. The beat becomes erratic. It flutters, stumbles, and slows. The rhythm of life, the drumbeat that began in the womb, enters its final coda. This process is a quiet departure. It is the antithesis of the violent deaths that defined previous eras of human history. It is not the bloody cough of tuberculosis, nor the fevered delirium of cholera, nor the traumatic shock of the sword or the bullet. It is a deletion. It is a fading out of the signal. For the observer, however, the scene is one of heartbreaking stillness. Imagine a mother finding her son, or a partner finding their beloved. The room is quiet. The television might still be playing. The phone might be buzzing with unanswered texts. The person looks like they are sleeping. They are often found in positions of casual repose, sitting in a chair, lying on a bed, sometimes even slumped over a table. There is no sign of a fight. The furniture is not overturned. The bedsheets are not twisted. The only sign that the thief has been there is the unnatural silence of the chest. The observer leans in, listening for the whisper of air, watching for the rise and fall of the shirt. They touch the skin, and it is cool. They shake the shoulder, but the weight is dead weight, the heavy, unresisting gravity of the body that has been vacated. The synthetic silence has achieved its ultimate perfection. It has extinguished the candle flame without even a flicker of wind. we must reflect on the philosophical weight of this chemistry. Throughout human history, death has been viewed as a struggle, a tearing away of the soul from the body. We speak of the death throes, the agony. But fentanyl creates a death that is technically an anesthesia. It is an oblivion that arrives on soft feet. This softness is what makes it so dangerous and so difficult to fight. The instinct for self-preservation relies on pain and fear to keep us alive. We avoid the fire because it burns. We avoid the cliff edge because of the vertigo. But the molecule removes the burn. It removes the vertigo. It makes the edge of the abyss feel like a warm bed. In the brain of the dying, a strange twilight unfolds. As the carbon dioxide builds, hypercapnia, it acts as a narcotic in itself. This is known as CO2 narcosis. In the absence of the panic alarm, the high levels of gas produce a sedative effect, a dizziness, a confusion that leads to unconsciousness. The brain is bathed in a double sedation, the opioid shutting down the neurons and the waste gas clouding the mind. The light at the end of the tunnel that survivors of near-death experiences speak of is often linked to the firing of neurons in a hypoxic brain. But in the fentanyl death, the lights simply go out. The complex architecture of consciousness, the memories of childhood, the love for family, the plans for tomorrow, the taste of morning coffee, all of it is dismantled, neuron by neuron, as the energy supply fails. There is a tragic irony in the fact that this molecule, designed to allow for the most delicate and life-saving surgeries, has become the agent of this mass extinction. Dr. Janssen designed fentanyl to allow the heart to be stopped and started again under controlled conditions. He designed it to suspend life so that it could be repaired. But on the street, there is no surgeon to restart the heart. There is only the suspension. The gurgle, sometimes heard in these final moments, the death rattle, is the sound of the throat muscles losing their tone, the airway collapsing, the fluid accumulating in the lungs. It is a mechanical sound, devoid of humanity. It is the sound of the machine shutting down. Let us consider the specific solitude of this death. In the days of the poppy, the opium den was a communal space. People lay together on mats, smoking, drifting in a shared haze. But the modern overdose is often intensely solitary. The user retreats to the bathroom, to the car, to the locked bedroom. They seek the privacy of the high. And in that privacy, the silence takes them. They die surrounded by the artifacts of the living, the toothbrush, the car keys, the half-eaten sandwich. The banality of the setting makes the tragedy more profound. The sacred transition from life to death happens next to the toilet or the steering wheel. The contrast between the infinite mystery of death and the gritty reality of the location is stark. And what of the rescue? We cannot speak of the silence without speaking of the noise that shatters it. The only force capable of breaking the grip of the molecule is naloxone, the antidote. If a paramedic or a friend arrives in time and administers the spray, the reversal is violent. Naloxone is an antagonist. It knocks the fentanyl off the receptors like a bouncer throwing a drunk out of a club. It strips away the warm blanket instantly. The user wakes up not in peace, but in precipitated withdrawal. They gasp, they vomit, they scream. The pain of the world rushes back in a tidal wave. The nerves, silenced for so long, fire all at once. This Lazarus effect highlights just how deep the sleep was. To bring someone back from a fentanyl overdose is to drag them out of a deep, dark ocean and throw them onto the jagged rocks of reality. It is a brutal mercy, and for many, the pain of the waking is so intense that their first thought is to seek the silence again. But for this chapter, we focus on the unreversed end. We focus on the millions for whom the naloxone did not come. The timeline of the end can be terrifyingly fast. With intravenous injection, the drop can happen in seconds. The needle is pushed, the rush hits, and before the plunger is even withdrawn, the breath stops. This is death by needle. The user does not even have time to finish the ritual. With the pills, the counterfeit M30, The process is slower, gastric. The pill dissolves in the stomach. The drug enters the liver, then the blood. The user might feel tired. They might lie down for a nap. They might tell their friend, "I'm just going to rest my eyes." The physiology of the sleep-death continuum is seamless. Sleep is a reduction in consciousness. Death, in this context, is simply a reduction that does not hit a floor. It continues down, past the REM cycle, past the deep delta waves, into the flat line. The reptilian brain, the guardian of the breath, is finally conquered. This structure, which survived the ice ages, the plagues, and the predators of the Serengeti, is defeated by a synthetic geometry. The evolution of millions of years is undone by the chemistry of a few decades. As the chest settles into its final stillness, the room remains unchanged. The dust motes dance in the light. The traffic noise outside continues. The world does not stop because a breath has stopped. The silence of the individual is swallowed by the noise of the collective, but the silence leaves a hole. It is a vacuum in the fabric of the family, a void in the community. The silent breath is not just a physiological event. It is a sociological eraser. It removes the voices of a generation. The final image of the overdose is one of peaceful abandonment. The hands are unclenched, the face is smooth, the lines of worry erased by the total relaxation of the muscles. It mimics the peace of the saints, the serenity of the enlightened. But it is a counterfeit peace. It is not the peace of resolution, but the peace of cessation. It is the silence of the empty house. The molecule has done its work. It has fit the lock. It has turned the key. It has closed the door. And as the oxygen leaves the brain cells, as the mitochondria flicker and die, the biography of the person ends. The story, which began with a cry in a delivery room, ends without a word in a quiet room. The synthetic silence is complete. The wind has stopped. The candle is out. And the dark, which was once a place of rest, has become a permanent address. We stand now at the summit of the mountain of history, looking down at the path we have climbed. The air here is thin and cold, and the view stretches back through the decades, past the chaotic valleys of the illicit market, past the orderly grid of the suburban expansion, past the bright, sterile lights of the operating theaters, and all the way back to the mist-covered plains of Belgium, where a single man stood in a laboratory and dreamed of a world without pain. We have arrived in the present day. We are living in the future that Dr. Paul Janssen constructed, atom by atom, in the quiet aftermath of the Second World War. And as we survey the landscape of the 21st century, we are left with a profound and haunting duality. We are holding a mirror, and the reflection that stares back at us is fractured. It is the story of a ghost in the glass. The history of fentanyl is not a straight line from darkness to light, nor from light to darkness. It is a circle. It is a paradox held in suspension. To understand the ghost in the glass, we must first look at the glass itself, the vial, the ampule, the vessel that holds the clear, colorless liquid. In one hand, this vial is the most precious tool in the arsenal of modern medicine. It is the angel of mercy. In the other hand, it is the most destructive force to ever sweep through the streets of the developed world. It is the agent of sorrow. Both are true. Both exist simultaneously. And in this simultaneous existence lies the terrible complexity of our relationship with the synthetic silence. Let us begin by honoring the light. It is easy, in the shadow of the crisis, to forget the miracle. But we must not forget. At this very moment, as the night deepens around the world, there are thousands of operating rooms humming with activity. Picture a hospital in a bustling metropolis. It is 3 a.m. The city outside is asleep. But inside the trauma center, the lights are blazing. A team of surgeons is standing over a patient whose chest has been opened, whose heart is being held in human hands. The procedure is a marvel of biological engineering, a defiance of death itself. But this defiance is only possible because of the silence. Without the synthetic opioids, without fentanyl and its cousins sufentanil and remifentanil, this surgery could not happen. The trauma of the knife would be too great. The shock to the system would be fatal. The anesthesiologist, standing at the head of the table, is the guardian of the threshold. They watch the monitors. They adjust the flow. They are administering a substance that is potent enough to kill the patient instantly, but they are using it to keep them alive. They are walking the razor's edge of the dose-response curve. In this context, the molecule is a grace. It allows us to repair the broken, to replace the failing, to heal the impossible. It is the invisible scaffolding that holds up the entire edifice of critical care. Consider the colonoscopy, the hip replacement, the setting of a shattered bone. These are the mundane miracles of our age. We have come to expect a life where acute pain is manageable, where surgery is a sleep rather than a torture. We have forgotten the screams of the pre-anesthetic era, the biting of the leather strap, the terror of the saw. We have forgotten because the ghost has allowed us to forget. It has washed away the memory of agony with the waters of oblivion. And consider the final act of life. For the terminal patient, for the body ravaged by cancer or age, the molecule offers a final, profound kindness. It allows the dying to pass not in a rictus of suffering, but in a state of calm. It softens the edges of the exit. It allows a grandmother to hear the voices of her children one last time without the distraction of pain. It allows a dignity that nature, in its cruelty, often denies. In the hospice ward, the fentanyl patch is not a demon. It is a sacrament. It is the chemical equivalent of a blessing, a laying on of hands that says, "Rest now. The struggle is over." This is the angel. This is the triumph of Dr. Janssen's vision. He sought to create a key that would fit the lock of pain perfectly, and he succeeded. He gave humanity a power that was previously reserved for the gods. But every light casts a shadow, and the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. We must now turn the mirror and look at the other face of the ghost. In the hands of the market, the molecule is an agent of sorrow. The same lipophilicity that allows it to enter the brain and soothe the surgical patient allows it to hijack the reward pathways of the addict. The same potency that allows for cardiac stability allows for the wooden chest and the silent breath. The efficiency of production that makes it cheap for hospitals makes it profitable for cartels. The tragedy of the modern era is that the market does not care about the intent of the inventor. The market cares only about the demand, and the demand for oblivion is infinite. We see the agent of sorrow in the empty bedrooms of parents who have lost children. We see it in the tent cities that have sprung up in the urban centers, populated by souls who have been hollowed out by the hunger for the high. We see it in the statistics that scroll across the news screens, numbers so large they lose their meaning, becoming a blur of mortality. Each digit in those thousands is a universe extinguished. Each digit is a laugh that will never be heard again, a potential that will never be realized. The molecule has changed the texture of grief. In the past, we lost our loved ones to disease, to war, to accidents. These were external forces, acts of fate. But the overdose is a different kind of loss. It feels like a theft. It feels like a mistake. It is a death that arrives in the mail, disguised as a pill. It is a death that costs $5. It is a death that happens in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. This banality adds a layer of surreal horror to the grief. It is the contrast between the majestic complexity of a human life and the cheap, white dust that ends it. We stand in the present day, and we realize that we are living through a mass poisoning event. It is not a contagion of a virus, but a contagion of chemistry. It is the result of a supply chain that has become too efficient, a global trade that moves faster than our ability to regulate it. The ghost in the glass has escaped the laboratory, escaped the hospital, and permeated the water table of our culture. It is in the music, it is in the streets, it is in the unspoken anxiety of every parent. This duality, the the medicine and the poison, is a reminder of the Promethean burden of science. Let us recall the ancient myth. Prometheus was the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. He saw our shivering, our fear of the dark, and he took pity on us. He climbed Mount Olympus, hid the ember in a fennel stalk, and brought it down to earth. With fire, we built civilization. We cooked our food, we forged our tools, we warmed our hearths. We drove back the predators. But fire also burns. Fire destroys cities. Fire is a weapon. And for his transgression, Prometheus was bound to a rock, his liver eaten daily by an eagle, a symbol of eternal torment. Dr. Paul Janssen and the chemists of the 20th century were our modern Prometheans. They did not steal fire. They stole the keys to the receptors. They stole the ability to manipulate the very biological machinery of the soul. They figured out how to turn off the signal of pain. They figured out how to decouple the mind from the suffering of the body. This was a theft of divine power. For millions of years, pain was the absolute dictator of biological life. It was the master that could not be disobeyed. By synthesizing fentanyl, we overthrew the dictator. We declared independence from the nervous system. But the price of that independence is the crisis we face today. The fire burns as easily as it warms. We have learned that you cannot simply turn off pain without risking the turning off of life. We have learned that the receptors we manipulate are not just switches for agony. They are the anchors of our breath, the roots of our consciousness. When we tamper with them, we are shaking the foundations of the house. The history of fentanyl is, at its core, the history of our desire to conquer pain. It is a deeply human story. We are creatures who suffer, and we are creatures who dream of a world without suffering. We are hardwired to seek relief. When the Sumerians scored the poppy, they were seeking it. When the alcoholic drinks the wine, he is seeking it. When the surgeon injects the anesthetic, she is providing it. This desire is noble. It is the impulse of compassion. But it is also dangerous. Because in our quest to eliminate pain, we have created a silence that is too deep. We have created a sleep from which we cannot wake. The ghost in the glass is a reflection of our own hubris. We thought we could engineer a perfect opioid. We thought we could use mathematics to scrub away the flaws of nature. We thought we could have the potency without the penalty. We were wrong. The penalty is built into the potency. The silence is built into the molecule. It is a story of atoms and receptors. It is a story of physics. The carbon, the hydrogen, the nitrogen, they are not evil. They are stardust. They are the same stuff that makes up the apple, the wood of the table, the air we breathe. The fentanyl molecule has no malice. It has no desire to kill. It simply is. It is a shape that fits a lock. It follows the laws of thermodynamics and affinity. The morality comes from us. The tragedy comes from the context. It comes from the profit and loss, the ruthless economics of the cartel, the desperate economics of the addict, the calculated economics of the pharmaceutical industry. It comes from the collision of this neutral object with the messy, broken, beautiful reality of human society. As we look back at the trajectory of the invention, we see the thin, trembling line between a peaceful sleep and a silence that never ends. It is a line measured in micrograms. It is a line that can be crossed by a trembling hand, by a mislabeled pill, by a moment of forgetfulness. So, where does that leave us? We cannot put the fire back in the stalk. We cannot undiscover the molecule. The knowledge is out there, drifting on the internet, stored in the minds of chemists, good and bad. The synthetic silence is now a permanent resident of our world. We must learn to live with it. We must learn to respect it, to fear it, and to control it. We must build new walls, not of stone, but of education and compassion. We must understand that the hunger for the drug is often a hunger for connection, for relief from a different kind of pain, the pain of isolation, of trauma, of hopelessness. If we want to fight the ghost, we cannot just fight the chemical. We must fight the darkness in which the chemical thrives. We must remember the lesson of the white dress. We must return to the idea of the drug as a sacred tool, not a commodity. We must treat it with the reverence it demands. It is not a product. It is a loaded weapon. It is a nuclear isotope of the soul. And we must remember the breath. As the night deepens around us, let us become conscious of our own breathing. Inhale, exhale. It is a rhythm we take for granted. It is automatic. It is the background music of our lives. But for the millions who have been touched by the shadow of fentanyl, this rhythm is no longer guaranteed. It is a fragile gift. In the quiet of the night, listen to the silence. There is a difference between the silence of peace and the silence of the void. The silence of peace is full. It is the silence of a sleeping child, the silence of a library, the silence of a forest after rain. It is a silence that breathes. The silence of the synthetic is empty. It is the silence of the moon. It is a cold, static stillness where nothing moves and nothing grows. Our task, as the inheritors of this Promethean fire, is to guard the breath, to ensure that the silence we seek is the restorative sleep of the living and not the eternal freeze of the dead. We must be the guardians of the threshold. We must watch over each other. We must carry the antidote. We must keep the light burning in the window. The story of fentanyl is not over. It is being written every day, in every city, in every hospital, in every home. It is a story that asks us a fundamental question. What is the value of pain? And what is the price of peace? Perhaps the answer lies in the balance. We must accept that pain is part of the fabric of life, a signal that we are alive, that we are feeling, that we are here. To try to erase it completely is to erase ourselves. We must use the fire to warm the house, but we must never let it consume the walls. The alchemist of Beerse, Dr. Janssen, passed away in 2003. He died before the full magnitude of the crisis unfolded. He died believing he had done good work. And he had. He had relieved the suffering of millions. But he also left behind a challenge. He left us with the ghost in the glass. Now, it is up to us to decide what to do with it. We close this chronicle not with a judgment, but with a meditation. We drift back from the specific to the universal. We see the earth spinning in the dark, a blue marble wrapped in a thin veil of atmosphere. We see the lights of the cities, the networks of trade, the invisible lines of chemistry connecting us all. We feel the weight of history, the ancient slumber of the poppy, the sharp precision of the laboratory, the chaotic flood of the street. It all flows together into the river of time. And on this river, we are all travelers. We are all fragile. We are all made of breath and bone. So, as you lay your head down to sleep, let the story of the molecule fade into the background. Let the complexities of chemistry dissolve. Return to the simple, rhythmic truth of your own existence. Inhale, exhale. The chest rises, the chest falls. This is the victory. This is the resistance. To breathe is to triumph. To breathe is to stay in the light. Let the synthetic silence remain in the glass. Let the true silence of the night wrap around you. A silence that is soft, organic, and safe. A silence that promises a morning. Sleep now, in the knowledge of the past and the hope for a wiser future. The history is told. The book is closed. The breath continues.